Have this evening is we have what may be our final budget work session. We have scheduled a tentative meeting for Tuesday the 30th, but if we finish tonight, we will not need to have that. That was scheduled as overflow in case we needed the additional time. So in all likelihood, we hope that this will be the last budget work session we need to have. At which point the final version of the budget will come before the council at our first regularly scheduled June meeting on June the 5th. We will begin, as we always do, with council comments and announcements, and I'd like to start by thanking the members of the council who worked on the affordable housing workshop. I know Colleen did some work on it, Terry did some work, and I understand that Joy did some work on it also. It was a very fruitful workshop. I found it not only informative, but actually inspiring, because it talked about some of the things that we have struggled to try and do in Tacoma Park, ways that they could actually be done and have been done in other communities. So I want to thank the council members that worked on that workshop for the very good job they did. The second part of, though, what I have to say about that is it also convinced me that if we are going to be serious about affordable housing in the future, particularly if we're going to be serious about homeownership opportunities, we're going to need to invest some upfront money in doing that. Fairfax County apparently puts, or is it Montgomery County? One of them puts a penny of the tax rate. They dedicate it to an affordable housing fund. I'm not going to bring that up on the reconciliation list, don't worry, but it is something that I think we're going to have to think seriously about. And when we're looking at budget reconciliation this evening, I think we should keep in mind that if we're going to get into affordable housing in a big way, we may have to think of some funding mechanism, some type of funding mechanism in the future. So keep that in mind in terms of the discussions that we have this evening. But it certainly was a very good workshop. Anybody else?
I want to second that, and I really appreciate the mayor for helping make it happen, and all the council members who participated.
I appreciate the recognition, Mayor Porter, but I think really Councilmember Clay deserves the majority of the credit, because she really was a workhorse on putting the quorum together.
She also gave a very nice presentation at the beginning on sort of where we were starting from. Anyone else?
Sorry, I called you a workhorse.
And if it's good to be loved, hold that thought.
Anyone else like to make a comment? Are there any public comments for this evening? This is the opportunity for comments on any of the items on our budget work session this evening, as well as anything else. And I'd ask when you come forward if you'd identify yourself and if you could keep your comments to 3 minutes. Thank you.
Sure. Hi, my name is Anna Summers. I live at 7625 Carroll Avenue. I live in Ward 2, and I serve on the board of the Long Branch Sligo Neighborhood Association. And I have here with me a couple of several other board members, actually, Eileen Sobek and Kathleen Prentice and Matt Hardwick. And we're all here because we understand that it's a little late in the budget process, but not too late, we understand, to get some of our own input into consideration. And we understand that in the budget as currently proposed that there isn't any money for improvements related to pedestrian safety in our neighborhood, and that's actually been an ongoing issue under discussion in our neighborhood. We now have a traffic calming committee that formed several months ago and has been meeting regularly and has come up with a number of considerations and solutions for our neighborhood that we're going to be working on over the next few months as part of the association activities. And so we believe that these projects aren't ready for implementation, but we believe they'll be ready soon, and a number of them are relatively cheap and could be implemented in this fiscal year. So we'd like, some of the issues that we're considering are things like traffic patterns and how to perhaps rearrange them, and putting in some speed bumps or changing traffic flows, and perhaps including a traffic circle. But a number of the things that we're considering are, we've been told, are relatively cheap. And so we hope that, we understand that there's been an allocation under consideration for Ward 1 and under the Safe Tacoma project, and also I think a project in Ward 6. And we'd just like to advocate that there be a consideration for a fair allocation across the wards, given the considerations and requests that are coming in. There's also a project on Elm and Jackson that, for that intersection, that sounds like it's very important, that should be under consideration as well. So we'd just like to see a reasonable allocation of the city resources reserved for projects in our neighborhood as well as others. And we hope that you take that into consideration. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mayor Porter, council members, Erwin Mack, Executive Director at Tacoma Langley Crossroads, 159 businesses. I have a folder marked many months ago, New Hampshire Corridor Plans. And I have two documents dated January 2006. One which has in it two of the most pressing development issues within Tacoma Park, the future of Washington Avenue's hospital campus and New Hampshire Avenue are getting immediate attention in the new year from the City Council. The second one is one that came to this council by Councilman Berry, listing 10 items, New Hampshire Avenue corridor redevelopment proposals. I was asked to come back tonight, as of last Monday, make my statements, and I'm frustrated by the 3-minute limitations, but I'll live with it. Although it's been 19 years of frustration and waiting for somebody to get really serious about a terrible plight, a blight called New Hampshire Avenue. I don't blame the city for not putting up signage on Eastern Avenue, welcome to Tacoma Park, because it should be embarrassment if a sign were there saying that this is the city of Tacoma Park. I'm not scolding you. I'm expressing disappointment and frustration about the fact that it's taken this long to get the recognition that this folder says it was going to get, and then it appears that this is not going to happen after all. What in the world do we need to do to get the city to look at its main thoroughfare and how to get proper recognition for it only when it's worth talking about? And I must express my frustration and hope that I live long enough to see something from my wheelchair having been done on New Hampshire Avenue.
Thank you. Did you?
I don't know what else to say.
There are some things in the budget. If you're talking about the second code inspector position,
assume.
we'll be talking about that this evening. But there are already some things in the budget that I don't believe the council has questioned that are dealing with development issues and dealing with redevelopment expertise, money, a fund for redevelopment money that we could use for that.
I know that in the running for the offices that some of you did for campaigning, it was made very clear by the majority that this was a concern. And I don't like to put that in quite those terms, except to say that's what was said. And we definitely want to believe that we have a right to say it's time for the two ends of Tacoma Park to meet. One from the Crossroads, one from Eastern Avenue, and let's make it right. And anything we can do to help, obviously, that's what we want to do.
Well, we do look forward to working with you, and as I said, there are already some things in the budget that would apply to that. Thank you.
Okay.
Mr. Mack, one of the things I would find helpful tonight, and not just with you, but with other people, is to hear some opinions about our taxes. I know that, within Ward 4 there has been some pushback on the tax increases, the proposed tax increase that comes from the increased property assessments. The budget proposed this year is about a 10% increase in tax revenue, and I just would like the contrast between the things that people are asking from the podium to be funded and how it's going to be paid for.
I obviously don't have an answer on taxes. I can talk about realignment, though. There are some things that may have been put in favor of this when they really shouldn't have been, since this was considered to be a priority. And that's about all they can ask at the moment, is say what realignment is possible to see to it that for the beginning, and it's going to take some time, obviously, to get this work on New Hampshire. It's not going to be quickly done. There's a major project, but but it deserves to get started, and it hasn't even gotten started.
Well, I think the beginning of it was that tour, which was quite successful at getting commitments from the folks at the county level to work with us on New Hampshire Avenue. And I think that was an important part of the strategy that we were employing. We don't have, and we won't have, even over a number of years, all the resources necessary to do the job that needs to be done on New Hampshire Avenue. So I think one of the first things that we needed to do was to get the commitment of a funding partner that has more resources than we have, which is Montgomery County. And of course, New Hampshire Avenue is in Montgomery County. That part of it is. And so that was a very important step, getting their commitment to do that. And that gives us the resources to move forward with some of the other things that we want to do, in addition to the funding that is being provided in the budget for redevelopment work.
At the moment, the city also has a great ally in Councilmember Will Campus, District 2 in Prince
Yes.
George's County, and
Yes.
a common person who knows what the needs are and certainly will cooperate with the city. So it seems to me that the iron is hot enough to start striking it and shaping it to make New Hampshire Avenue what it deserves to be.
Well, the county is passing its budget also at this same time, and assuming that their commitments have some counterpart in the resources that the county will provide, I think we will be in good shape to begin at that point.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
Hello, my name is Matt Hardwick, and I too am a member of Ward 2. I want to first of all thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I'm also a member of the Long Branch Sligo Citizens Association, and we have become greatly concerned with the lack of budgetary items for Ward 2 with regards to pedestrian traffic as well as traffic calming measures. As many of you know, this city is a growing city with lots of families with small children. Specifically in Long Branch, in this the Long Branch Sligo neighborhood, you can see small children running around all over the place. And however, there's quite a bit of danger with that, because there's an incredible amount of traffic that travels from New Hampshire Avenue to Carroll Avenue, and it passes through our neighborhoods. And we would like to see some effort made in order to calm this traffic one way. Traffic signs, new speed bumps, as well as some other traffic calming measures. And as Anna Summers mentioned before, we're currently working on that. And we're not the only neighborhood that has these traffic issues. We know that south of Sligo Creek, on Elm Avenue, there's a considerable amount of traffic, and that there's a lot of work being done right now in order to improve that situation. We'd like to express our support for the traffic calming measures at Elm and Lincoln, and hope that that gets funded as well. Also in our own neighborhood, Palmer Lane desperately needs to be paved, and we know that that's an issue that we'd like to see also come onto the budget. We'd also like to express interest in the lighting measures at Forest Park, and is there anything else? Apologize. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good evening. Thanks for the opportunity to speak this evening. My name is Joanna Hofschneider. I live on Hayward Avenue in Ward 2, and I'm also here this evening to speak about the importance of some traffic calming measures. As the Council is no doubt aware, there is presently an exploratory traffic calming measure underway at Elm and Lincoln. And I would strongly exhort the Council to include funding for some traffic calming solution at that junction in the budget this cycle. Significant time and manpower, and therefore money, has already been invested in exploring various different options here, and no option has yet been settled upon. But it's vital that there is some traffic calming measure there. I understand that there are always many different viewpoints in a neighborhood, and that not everyone is united behind one solution here. But the need for traffic calming does not primarily come from neighborhood drivers. Neighborhood drivers have a vested interest in driving safely through the neighborhood. What we're concerned about here is cut-through traffic that comes through the neighborhood at speeds up to 50 miles an hour to mitigate their commute along 410. They cut down on Elm, cut through the neighborhood, and go back again through Carroll and the Long Branch neighborhood to get back onto their major highways. About 3 weeks ago, at the start of the afternoon rush hour, I was with my son, who is 7, and some friends who have a 7-year-old and a 4-year-old and their dog, and crossing the road, holding the children's hand. And it was only when we actually yelled at a lorry driver that he stopped to let us continue crossing. I'm confident that his speed was extremely high, because as we all know in the days of road rage, if you yell at someone about their driving, they will yell back. He did not yell back. He visibly paled and sat there stunned, apologizing to us when he realized how much danger he had put small children in by his reckless driving. These sorts of solutions are fairly small. I fully understand Councilmember Siemens' comment about the taxes. Similarly to Mr. Mack, I guess this would come to realignment. I think that as we look at raising the taxes on homeowners, we should look at the concerns that are vital to our neighborhoods where those homeowners live. Please, please preserve funding for traffic calming in this budget cycle. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Jennifer Shields, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak this evening. Like Joanna, I live in Ward 2. I live right on the corner of Elm and Lincoln. The sign for Elm and Lincoln is in my front yard. And I echo what Matt had to say and Joanna had to say about traffic calming. And I actually spoke directly with you about it, Mayor Porter, when you were going around before your election, and we spoke about it. We really live in fear of the cut-through traffic. People zoom past our homes so fast, especially during rush hour. I have 3 small children myself. We have no sidewalks. Most people don't have driveways, so there are cars parked. And I feel I can't let my children walk to their friend's house, cross the street, even a 9-year-old, because people are trying to avoid the light at the co-op, so they can't cut through Manor Circle anymore. There's a sign saying they can't cut through at Jackson anymore during rush hour. So they're cutting down Elm and across Lincoln at very, very high speeds. The intersection is so wide that there's no reason for them to really slow down. What they do is they just cut straight across, going down a hill, and the speeds are very high. Pedestrians are just really taking their lives in their hands at certain times of day to go through the neighborhood, and it's not a good situation. We're really looking forward to the road being repaved, and we've been, trying to advocate and have been told, well, when the road is repaved, that's the time to address these issues of traffic calming. And WSSC is going to be redoing our water, which means finally the road will get repaved. Elm will be repaved. So we've had so much support from people in the neighborhood, and there's some different opinions about what the best traffic calming might be, but everyone who lives in that immediate neighborhood right on that corner there feels a need for traffic calming and wants to work together. We've put a lot of time and a lot of, I think, cooperation into trying to come up with some solutions along with the city engineer, and Daryl Braithwaite has been very helpful. And so we would just really exhort you to please include in the budget traffic calming for our corner. Please help us keep this corner as safe as it can be, especially just coping with the amount of cut-through traffic. It's just imperative. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
My name is Meriwether Jones. I'm also speaking on this issue. I also live at the corner of Elm and Lincoln. It is actually terrifying to be out in that street. I don't know how many of you have been there, but it is a very wide turn intersection. 2 nights ago, my wife and I were taking a walk. It was about 10 o'clock. A car came, as they do, the cut through from 410, came down Elm, turned on Lincoln, It must have been going at least 50 miles an hour through the turn and almost hit my wife. She was like half a block away. We were half a block away from the intersection, but he was going so fast that he couldn't turn out of the trajectory he was in. And she was standing right by the curb, and he almost hit her. And she literally threw herself on the grass. That was just 2 nights ago. I have 2 14-year-old sons. They play outside, and I basically get them to go play in other neighborhoods because it's just too scary to see any child anywhere near that intersection. So I also urge the council to maintain the funding that is in play for that calming. And I also wanted to echo the deep gratitude that we feel towards Public Works. They've been really responsive, really exceptionally responsive, coming in to meet with the group of the neighbors at night, and then responding within days with these 2 different plans that we've been experimenting with. And everyone's commented on just how extraordinary that has been for any government that we've had an experience with. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
My name is Karen Vernon. I also live in Ward 2 at 800 Hayward. And I am speaking also about the traffic calming at Elm and Lincoln. My visual aide, unfortunately, went home to go to bed. But my young daughter, Piper, who's 4, was one of the children in the intersection when I think it was a dump truck, came through, and we all had to sort of scream, parents running into the street, waving their arms, trying to get the truck to slow down, trying to rush the children out of the street as fast as we could. It was very frightening, and the amount of traffic that comes through during the commute period is very noticeable. I think one of the things that I'm really hoping with the traffic calming, as well as slowing people down, is that we'll disincentivize people using it as a cut-through, so that we will just have less congestion on those neighborhood streets during our commute times. So please include this money for this traffic calming. We've had 2 great community meetings, lots of work and effort that I think would be very, very disappointing and disillusioning if then nothing came of it. Also, I have a written statement from Gina McNeil, who was here earlier and took the kids home. And our neighbor, Marnie Bars, also sent an email to the city clerk this afternoon. It's her birthday. She chose not to come and speak here on her birthday. I don't know why. But so I don't know if this can be submitted to someone, Gina's statement. I will take it over to Barbara, and thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. Anyone else?
Good evening. My name is Bo Ellis, and I live at the corner of Auburn and Elm, and I'm here to speak on, guess what, traffic calming. This issue is really near and dear to our hearts. In fact, my wife and I left dinner on the table to come here once we found out about it. Normally, I'd rather chew aluminum foil than, no offense, than to come to one of these. But it amazes me.
Some nights we would too, yes.
It amazes me that no one has been killed yet at that intersection. And our neighbors, we have several neighbors with young children, and Joff and Jennifer have 3. And my wife is now pregnant, but before that I thought, man, I could imagine having kids on this street and letting them, play out in the yard for fear of them, getting creamed by any one of a number of cars that blow through the stop signs, at these 2 intersections on a regular basis. I mean, the disregard for the current traffic pattern, not the experimental one, but the regular traffic pattern, is unbelievable. So for what it's worth, I want to throw, my 2 cents in on this, and please move forward. We appreciate what the city's done so far with allowing us to experiment with these 2 options, but we just would request that we go forward and actually do one of them or a combination of the 2. Thanks.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Eileen Sobek from 7637 Carroll Avenue, and I am co-president with Matt Hardwick of the Long Branch Sligo Citizens Association. And I support everything that's been said today here by Ward 2 citizens, and I wanted to address a little bit Councilmember Seaman's concern of how we're going to pay for this wish list. I can't speak for the members of my neighborhood association about whether they would be willing to have their tax rate increased to cover some of these things. I personally would, but I'm not going to speak for the neighborhood on that. What I will say, though, is that if there is a limited pot of resources, first of all, I think you're hearing that traffic calming and pedestrian safety is a huge priority throughout the city, and therefore I think that, to the extent that we are weighing and balancing other concerns, this has to be high on the list. The other thing is, to the extent there is a limited pot for these kinds of projects, I think it needs to be spread fairly and equitably throughout the city. I think Safe Tacoma is a worthy project. I think we all benefit from safety measures in the downtown area. On the other hand, it is only one area of our city, and we actually spend a lot more time in our own neighborhoods, walking down the street, driving, putting up with the perils that you've heard tonight about traffic. And I think that the city ought to have a plan like it does for paving, for prioritization and for citizen input on that, and that there ought to be sort of a general, equitable, fair distribution. Obviously, if there are some projects that have high priority and are expensive, that's fine, but let's put them on the table and discuss them, and let's have a plan for how we're going to get to the concerns throughout the city. And I think what you're hearing tonight is that there is a very strong perceived need throughout Ward 2 for issues that range from traffic bumps, traffic circles, sidewalks, which are, I know they're expensive and difficult to put in. On the other hand, they are absent from most of our side of the ward, and I think contribute to why we have these problems and concerns, because there's no safe place for people to be outside their homes if they're not, when they're outside. So that is my plea for not having one project or another swallow all of the available resources in any given year. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Dan Robinson. I live on Grant Avenue, and I've had a few things rolling through my mind that kind of resonate with the discussions that are going on here tonight. I guess I boil them down to three modest proposals, and they're relatively unscientifically come to, and I haven't done a lot of research on any of them, but I've had some experience in some. In any case, and it's I think they address both Ward 2's concerns about traffic and also Councilmember Seaman's concerns about how to get a grip on when people come and want more in their budgets or their ward's budgets. But I'll start with the one that's probably the most, I don't know which one's more out there, but here I go. In Mount Rainier, they have a traffic circle right on Rhode Island Avenue, and it seems to move traffic very well through that intersection, and it's a fairly complex intersection. I've been looking at the Tacoma Junction intersection for a while, and I go back, almost 20 years talking with people about how to address that intersection. And I wonder if you could get our city engineer to look at a traffic circle for that intersection. There are a number of streets which come in. Again, the traffic circle on Rhode Island Avenue seems to do a pretty good job of getting people through. It's, I guess you'd say, democratic in that whoever gets there first gets to go through without having to stop. So there's my first big idea.
Dan, sorry, can you tell me where you're proposing that traffic circle?
In
Tacoma Junction.
Oh, great.
Which is arguably a bad intersection.
Yes, it's actually something safe roadways had done.
My second big idea is has to do with the budget and this process where at the last minute people who have important needs come to you, the full council, in your deliberations, and there's a certain amount of jockeying for funding. I know also that, well, let me get to the point. If there was some equitable way to distribute the budget among wards, and then the wards, in each of the wards was able to negotiate about what their own priorities were, given a fixed amount of money, that might resolve some of these things, because each ward then would have a fixed amount that they could allocate how they wanted, more towards safety programs because that area is more prone to crime at that particular time, or more towards traffic problems because that ward is more in need of traffic solutions. So I just put that out there. I don't know if it's possible to divide up the city budget into 6 different portions and allocate the expenditures that you make on that basis. But if it were the case that was possible, then each ward could, in a sense, negotiate with their council member what their own priorities are and figure it out that way. The third and final big idea I have, and I'll keep it short, Mayor Porter, don't be concerned about that, is that if you want to know how people really feel about an increase in the tax rate or the taxes in our city as a whole, why don't you ask them in an advisory capacity on a ballot? And it should be a very fairly, I know that you've done that before, put things on a ballot to ask them whether they agree or disagree with something. And of course, it's somewhat perilous to boil something down to something as simple as do you want to spend more or don't you want to spend more? But perhaps you could place it on a ballot in a way that seemed fair. That would you be willing to spend an extra 10% if it were to mean that each ward were to get a larger budget or something along those lines?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Just in terms of your first comment about the traffic circle, the council received a presentation some weeks ago from our community pedestrian walkthrough. I'm getting the title wrong, and that was actually one of the recommendations. So it is something that we have on our agenda to talk about.
Oh, great. Yeah.
So. Anyone else?
Hi, Chantal Rosell on Maple Avenue. Just wanted to come back and remind you of our discussion the other night and just let you know people are very excited about the potential decisions you might make tonight to fund Safe Tacoma. Just wanted to let people know this is a very long-standing issue in Tacoma Park. Safe Tacoma has been discussed by the full council, and money was put into the budget last year to say if we get a partner, then we would be committed to this. We now have a partner in D.C., so this isn't something that's rash and last minute. This has been under development for 2.5 years. So I'm not going to say anything more because I think I said my piece the other night, but I just want to let people know that this isn't sort of a last-minute money grab. This is a project that's been scoped out, and the chief of police has put forward for the city. So thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? All right. Well, if there's no one else, we will move on to the next items on the agenda. And we're going to very quickly move through a review of the remaining sections of the budget. And then the final item, which I anticipate will be the biggest item and the longest item, will be for us to make final decisions on the budget, on the reconciliation items, which includes many of the items that you all have expressed an interest in. So we will, assuming that all goes well, we will in fact make those decisions before we complete the meeting this evening. But we're going to before we do that, we're going to very quickly move through the capital improvement program. We mentioned some specific items, but the overall review, debt service, special revenue, and then go to the community center fund.
Yeah, if I could direct the council's attention to the revised capital improvement program that was included as part of the agenda packet for this evening. Did everyone get there? The other thing I would just kind of help us all follow along is there was a 3-page handout that was left at your place at the dais this evening. The first page of that talks about the fund balance projection. If you could turn to the second page, it might just help put some numbers with some of the items I'm going to talk about. One of the things we tried to do this year in terms of the capital improvement program is really show the full breadth, if you will, of the capital projects that are contemplated for FY07, regardless of their funding source. So what you'll see in the document in this year's budget, basically, with the exception, I would add, of the Stormwater Management Fund and the Community Center Fund, is any of the capital projects that are included in either the General Fund or the Special Revenue Fund, so you could sort of get an idea of what the CIP looks like in its entirety. You've had the opportunity throughout this budget process to hear from each of the department heads about specific items that they were requesting. Did want to just highlight some changes for you that have been made and just kind of walk you through those. The first one deals with the salt storage facility. Actually, let me try to do them in order that you have in front of you, is the van for the Recreation Department. When Ms. Hadeven came before you, you may recall that the pricing at that time was $53,000. The council had a fairly extensive discussion with the Recreation Director about the merits of having a larger capacity vehicle, and in light of that, the revised document that is before you reflects a cost of $56,000. I think after you all talked about it, Ms. Hademan had the opportunity to go back and discuss the matter with her staff. I think what the general consensus was that it appeared it was a very small amount of money to basically have some larger capacity in terms of being able to serve our residents and have participants in our programs. That is really the only the change for the Recreation Department. I think everyone's familiar with that, so there's probably no questions. If everyone can kind of flip to the back page of the revised CIP, and just wanted to point out a couple other things, some of which have to do with timing. As the council is aware, I believe, if an item or a project is not actually completed prior to July 1st of 2006, then that expenditure will actually be reflected in FY07. In the past few days, Mr. Hobbs and I had the opportunity to touch base with some of the department heads with projects that we were questioning whether or not they would actually be finished prior to July 1st. When those things occur, there are really two ways to handle that. They can either be handled through the encumbrance process, or basically the amounts are essentially rebudgeted or reappropriated. The Director of Finance and I had a discussion about this matter about a year ago when she first started, and both of us prefer to go ahead and rebudget those monies rather than utilizing encumbrances. I think it gives a clearer picture of what you're actually spending. There were several projects that sort of fell into this category where the council had provided funding in FY06, but based on their current status, we do not believe they will be completed prior to July 1st and consequently would be booked in FY07. One of those was actually on the first page, and I'm not trying to get you to keep flipping back and forth, but that was the police cars that the council authorized by ordinance. I believe it was in early May. Based on the most recent information that we have, we do not believe that those cars will actually be physically received by the city by the end of June. So the figure that you see right now for patrol cars in FY07 is basically a combination of the funding you previously discussed for the next fiscal year, essentially new monies, and basically the rebudgeted or carried over monies from FY06. So it really is just a timing issue. Kind of falling into that same category, under the facilities, which are on the second page of the revised CIP or the back page, are several items basically in the Public Works Department. This would be the replacement of the refueling system and replacement of the fuel tanks. It's combined about $55,000. In talking to Ms. Braithwaite, she does not believe that those items or those projects will be completed prior to July 1st. Once again, she would like to move forward with those projects, and there is work ongoing, but she has asked that those FY06 monies be carried over into FY07. In regard to the salt dome, there's kind of two things going on. One is exactly what Ms. Braithwaite felt that the project would actually cost, and also the timing of the money. You will notice on the sheet in the handout tonight, there is a debit of $58,000 from the original CIP that was distributed to you all in early April. That is actually not a true net reduction of $58,000. What Ms. Braithwaite had originally assumed is that she would expend $30,000 in FY06. The budgeted amount for FY06 is $80,000, as a reminder, and that we would be spending $75,000 in FY07 for a total project cost of $105,000. Based on her current plan, she believes the full $80,000 included in this year's budget will be expended, and then she has modified her FY07 request to $17,000. So basically, it's $8,000 less than what she had originally predicted. So the $58,000 that are shown on the reconciliation sheet distributed this evening basically just represents the change in the amount originally requested for FY07, but I did not want to mislead anybody that that's a true net reduction of that amount. The last item where we get into some timing issues in terms of the capital improvement program has to do with the Gateway Wayfinding signage system. There'll be some further discussion about that this evening. There was $20,000 included in the FY06 budget, a $20,000 requested for FY07. Ms. Dames is in the audience and will basically be addressing this matter during the reconciliation process, since it was one of the items on the list. But based on the current staff request, the FY06 dollars have been requested to be carried over into FY07, which is why you see a FY07 figure of $40,000. So I apologize for taking some time. I just did want to kind of walk you through those changes so there was no confusion. In terms of the total CIP, what is before you, once again excluding the Community Center Fund or Stormwater Management Fund capital projects, is a CIP of approximately $1.67 million. As I mentioned earlier, the funding for this is actually from a combination of sources. There's a number of projects included in the special revenue funds, which we'll be talking about in just a few moments. There are certain street projects that will be paid for out of the street loan proceeds that the borrowing that the city took out in July of 2005. And I'm looking at the very last page of the CIP. Street loan proceeds in the approximate amount of $91,000 are anticipated to be expended in FY07. We'll also be utilizing some of the funds that have been set aside in prior years in the equipment replacement reserve, which, as the council is aware, but perhaps the community may not be, is where we set aside monies for the known future replacement of vehicles and equipment. And in FY07, we'll be kind of drawing down that reserve, if you will, as intended, by approximately $301,000. As it stands right now, the capital improvement program that is before you anticipates spending about $738,000 in general fund monies on capital projects. So that's kind of, I guess, what the CIP looks in an overview. Certainly, I'd be happy to answer any questions that the council may have. I do know that you had an opportunity, obviously, to talk more specifically about some of the projects with each of the department heads.
Terry?
Thank you. I just wanted to check to make sure I understood on the police cars, where we had talked about purchasing an additional, or budgeting for an additional 9 cars, I believe, in FY07. Is that in addition to cars that were originally budgeted in FY06?
We purchased 9 in 06. You approved that, and I think it was 6 for 07.
Okay, I got my numbers back. Okay.
Yeah. But that's the combination of both of them. We move the monies out of. They won't be deliverable by 30 June.
All right. Thank you.
Any other questions about capital improvement? Okay. As you said, we did go over the details of this with each of the department heads.
I think the next item that the mayor had asked that I just briefly touch on is the debt service fund, and there is a special tab for the debt service fund in your original budget binder, and this is not something that has changed at all throughout this process. Basically, the debt service fund accounts for any type of principal and interest payments that the city may have on any bonds, borrowing, or other types of debt obligations of the city. Included on the very first page of this section of your budget binder is basically a brief project description. There's further detail attached. It basically just gives you a brief overview of what those borrowings are and what the associated principal and interest payments with each of those obligations. There's been no borrowings that have occurred in FY06, as the council is aware, because certainly you would have authorized those. So basically what is before you this evening are basically just the continued debt service payments on prior obligations of the city. It's basically a mirror image of what you have in the current year budget, just different amounts. So I'd be happy to answer any questions anyone has, but it's pretty much what you reviewed for the current year budget.
I guess the confusion comes in with on the community center. We had budgeted revenues from a loan. Were shown in the for the community center, but yet the debt service on that loan isn't budgeted on this in this section. Is that correct?
No, it is. The debt service on the community center is actually in the debt service division of the budget. Are you saying that you're...
I'm saying for the loan. Okay, never mind. I understand.
Okay. Sorry.
Can I just go back for a second and just get a clarification on the CIP? I understand what you were saying, and I'm not disagreeing with going with the route of moving the items into FY07 from FY06 instead of encumbering. What I'm wondering is how easy it's going to be when comparing budgets year to year. There could potentially be enough movement of those items from one year to the next that it'll lower one year significantly and raise the other one and it'll look like there were big swings in terms of expenditures, and I was wondering how that gets, if that gets noted enough places so it's easy for somebody to track, or is it going to be people coming up with questions years from now and somebody has to go dig for the answers?
My thought was when we moved, and I don't know if this would address your concern, Councilmember Williams, is when we actually put the final budget document together is to have some footnotes or other notation indicating which projects were, essentially carryover
Right.
or reappropriated projects from FY06, and to note that in some manner.
Okay, good. That would do it.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay. If there's no other questions about debt service, the mayor had also asked me just to briefly go over the special revenue funds kind of in their entirety. There was an updated summary sheet for this fund included in your agenda packet. Once again, you had the opportunity to talk to each of the department heads about their specific projects, and many of them are in the audience. I'm sure they'd be happy to answer any further questions that you have, but especially the special revenue funds is where the city accounts for projects that are grant funded or tied to a specific grant. The change that has been made since this was presented to you originally about 6 weeks ago deals with the expenditures for the police department. As the council is aware, the existing CSAFE or in Tacoma Langley basically is essentially grant funded, with most of the funding coming from the Governor's Office of Crime Control and Prevention. As a standard practice, typically your allocation, for instance, for FY07 would be the same amount as the city received in FY06. There was an additional pot of money, if you will, of about $200,000 that became available this year that the various jurisdictions could file supplemental grant applications and apply for. Mary Kendall, who is the program director for the Tacoma Langley CSAFE, put in a request for, I believe it was $39,000, of about a $200,000 pot, was successful in getting a supplemental appropriation of $26,000. Of that amount, $21,000 is specifically targeted for the hiring of a social worker to work with at-risk youth for anti-gang initiatives. The social worker, as I understand it, would be part of the HEAT team, essentially, providing some input in terms of, keeping kids out of gangs or helping kids that are already at risk. The remaining amount, which is, I'm doing my math right, $5,000, is kind of geared towards the same target population, but it's to provide at-risk youth with job skills training, and hopefully to provide them, with some fundamental skills to, help them in their pursuit of gainful employment. That's the change that basically has occurred in the special revenue fund since this document was given to you originally, and would like to take this opportunity to thank Chief Kramer as well as Ms. Kendall for basically their work in pursuing that additional funding for the CSAFE. Most of the grants that the city receives do not require matches. There are two specific grants included in the special revenue funds that do. Those would be the program open space funds, which, as the council I believe is aware, has a 25% match. And I'm sure someone from the police department can correct me if I'm wrong, because I always get these confused. It is the LLEBG grants from the United States Department of Justice that basically have an approximate 10% match. The way those matches are accounted for, if you look at the budget summary sheet, is you'll see an operating transfer into the special revenue funds. The amount is $4,639. It's kind of listed under the other financing sources. What that $4,639 represents is the required city match for those two grant programs, and it's essentially accounted for as an operating transfer from the general fund to the special revenue funds. So it essentially represents the city's contribution for those projects. If there's any questions about the special revenue funds, the staff and I would be happy to answer them.
One of the questions that I think has come up in the past and may still be a concern is the issue of how the council gets involved in deciding what grants to apply for. Now, there are some things, for example, open space things usually come through us as part of the open space discussion and that sort of thing. But and of course we know about the CSAFE program also, but there's always things that come forward to us in the budget that the council, this would be the first time that they've heard about it. Can you talk a little bit about how that comes forward?
I think you touched on it, Mayor, and I think there's a variety of ways the council is involved. Certainly the program open space allocation, the council takes specific legislative action by resolution, delineating those projects that you want staff to submit to the Board of Public Works. Similarly, any type of projects that are funded with CDBG funds, after it goes through the citizen committee process, ultimately come to the council as a recommendation from that committee, and you provide specific direction and approval of those projects. The ones that probably, and I may ask Chief Kramer if she would like to touch on this, is the variety of the police department grants, because there certainly are a number of funding sources. The CSAFE program the council is aware of, and basically we pursue the standard grants to fund that program. The other grants are basically, I understand, fairly standard grants typically that the department can apply for. I believe in some instances there is a public input process in terms of how those funds ultimately are designated, but I'll defer to the chief to comment on this further.
Yeah, you were able to provide us information on what the grants would be used for, but I guess what I'm asking is more of a process question. How you decide what to apply for and how that decision gets made, and how the public and council input into that decision.
We're typically notified electronically with regard to the justice assistance grants, and it's something that the police department has historically applied for. It's a very easy process. There's a very small amount of money that is required as far as a match, 10%. And when we're notified of the opportunity to apply for these, then we consult with the city manager to get authorization to do that. And we have to give, in some cases, a preliminary idea of how we may want to spend this money. We tell them something up front, but with the Justice Assistant Grant process, that requires a public hearing process, which affords opportunity for input from the community as well as council to provide input on how we are going to spend this money. Homeland Security money, for instance, is an example of a grant that we would have to give an idea up front, but aren't necessarily bound by the idea that we give to them.
All right, thank you.
Are there any other questions about the special revenue funds? Okay. The last fund I just wanted to revisit, because there have been some changes, is the Community Center Fund, and there was an updated budget summary sheet in your agenda packet, as well as some description of what changes have been made, but I'd like just to walk you through it for a few minutes. One of the things, and just to kind of highlight a change, has to do with the sale of the 2 Piney Branch properties. As the council may be aware, I think from it was included in a prior S&I report, we have closed on the commercial property on Piney Branch, which was purchased by Sue Wong, and that has closed. The proposed purchaser of the residential property, Mr. Hanratty, and this is not through any fault of his own, but has encountered some difficulties with obtaining traditional mortgage financing. Apparently, when someone who comes out and basically does an appraisal of the property, I think the council's well aware the property is a bit of a fixer-upper, and Mr. Hanratty was more than willing to kind of contribute his own sweat equity as well as his own funds to do that. But what a mortgage company, as I understand it, tends to look at is, should there be any default, what is their ability to recover their funds? And I'd say they look at a property that is not in the best of shape, and so he was encountering some difficulties going that route. The company that actually handled the settlement for the commercial property apparently has been in discussions with Mr. Hanratty trying to provide some assistance, has pointed him to some smaller financial institutions, and who hopefully would view it as almost more of a construction loan type of financing until the property is somewhat in better shape. He is continuing to have those discussions with those financial institutions, and I guess time will tell, how that bears out. The bottom line, however, is I don't think that we will be in a position to close on the residential property prior to July 1st. So as we just talked about in terms of the capital improvement projects, essentially we need to account for that fact. Where you see this on the community center fund is if you look under other financing sources and uses, you'll see operating transfers in. Basically what that represents are operating transfers in from the general fund. A portion of the amount you see projected for FY06 has to do with the transfer of the proceeds from the sale of the commercial property. Essentially, the revenues that the city gets from that are accounted for in the general fund, because technically the general fund, being the primary operating fund of the city, owns the property, if you will. So the revenue comes into the general fund, and since the council has designated the proceeds from the sale of those properties for the community center project, it essentially gets transferred from one fund to another. So that is one change that you see in the community center fund in terms of the revenue side of it. On the expenditure side of the equation, as well as on the operating transfer side for 07, I needed to take into account the council's recent authorization to move forward with the installation of an elevator cab in the shaft on the front of the building. So what the change from the prior document that you received basically reflects that approximately $180,000 for the elevator, which shows up in both expenditures, and if you were trying to track through, you'll notice that the operating transfer for 07 is up by a similar amount, as well as accounting for the sale of the residential property on Piney Branch. Other than those couple items, the community center fund budget looks the same as it did before. Just as a reminder, we did talk about this before, and I don't know if the council wants to have any further discussions. The staff at this point has budgeted the program open space funds that the council previously indicated that it supported using for the gym projects for FY07. So when you look above under intergovernmental revenues, you'll see a figure of approximately $435,000. What that represents is the share of the FY07 program open space funds that the council by resolution indicated you wanted applied to the gym project. There had been some discussion about this and some thoughts voiced by a resident in terms of how the city handles the accounting for the community center fund, and just wanted to reiterate my prior comments both for the benefit of the council and for the community. When you do a budget, basically it reflects those monies that you actually think will be received during the fiscal year in question as well as expended. The program open space funds as well as the state bond bill funds are all on a reimbursement basis. The city has to go to the Board of Public Works, get approval for the project. The city then has to essentially front those monies and go through the reimbursement process. In my opinion, I don't think it's likely that we will have basically gone through the program open space funds and gone through the state bond bill funds prior to the end of FY07. Certainly, if that turns out to be the case, the council through the budget amendment process can recognize that. The fact that the state bond bill monies are not budgeted in FY07 was noted in the transmittal letter and specifically addressed by me, so there was no confusion in the community as to why those monies were not reflected in the FY07 budget. In my mind, if we honestly don't think we will be expending them, and I think that's unlikely, all that happens is if you budget them, you're going to end up with a huge budget variance. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that, but I personally believe that we should be trying to budget as realistically as we can. If it makes the council more comfortable, in addition to the noting that in the budget transmittal message, which is published as part of the budget document, certainly I'd be happy to add a footnote or something on this page so people could see it in a variety of places. And that might be a way to just try to address this concern in multiple areas, just so it's clear to anyone in the public who's reading the budget document how we're handling that. So those are the changes that have been made.
Sorry if I, Dennis,
That's okay.
It's Thursday, not Monday. I'm not in the right gear. On the house on Piney Branch Road, did you say that that amount is or is not reflected in this fund now?
It is, the residential property, Councilmember Siemens, is reflected in the operating transfer for FY07. It was $226,500. I mean, at this point, we are still hopeful that Mr. Hanratty will be able to, to work through those issues. Obviously, at such time as he determines or we determines that he cannot do that, we'll probably need to come back to the council and have some further discussions.
Okay, and then my other question is there anything that we can do to help make that work?
I know Ms. Daines has been in contact with Mr. Hanratty. Certainly, I know the settlement company had actually put him in touch with some specific financial institutions. I don't know, Sarah, is there anything else you'd like to add?
One option that was proposed was that the city, as the current owner of the property, make the necessary repairs to establish the property as being livable. Basically, it would be some plumbing work, a lot of plumbing work. And then at that point in time, because the property would then be livable, the bank would approve the loan and the additional costs would be assessed to Mr. Hanratty.
That would involve some staff time, would it not?
That would involve a fair amount of staff time.
I think that there's a loan program that lets a nonprofit pick up a property and roll it over. What's it called, like a 203K loan or something like that? They can roll it over. They can have a preset buyer for it. They do it in D.C. all the time. And maybe that would be an option for this property.
In speaking with the city attorney's office, if the transaction does not go through as originally intended, we would have to go back out through the required disposition steps, which would either be, this one was sold for closed or sealed bids for a fixed price. So we would have to go back out and rebid the property, and then we could, in theory, negotiate that or make those connections so that they could then bid on the property at that time.
So he can't assign his right to purchase?
I don't believe that's part of the current contract that we have, but I can check.
I think it's certainly worth pursuing. Obviously, Mr. Hanratty lives not too far from the property.
Right.
Has really expressed an interest in making it his home, and certainly I think it's in everybody's best interest to examine every option that we can to see if we can make this work for all of us.
I appreciate our continued work to try to facilitate this.
At this point on the agenda, I don't know what the council wishes to do. You had a
Did we need to talk about if we were going to make an expenditure out of the community center funds for feasibility study?
Yeah, we can certainly talk about that. I mean, one of the issues that could have a budgetary impact, depending on how the council chooses to handle it, is at this point the council has committed to kind of moving forward with a feasibility study for the proposed gym. Obviously, we're in the process of trying to get that RFP done, and I hope to have a draft done by perhaps the end of next week. As I mentioned, any of the state bond bill monies or the program open space funds do require the Board of Public Works to basically bless the project, if you will, before any expenditure of funds occur. If the city were to move forward with expending monies before that approval is secured, essentially we would not be entitled to get reimbursement under either the state bond bill program or the program open space. The Board of Public Works will start reviewing applications in July. Obviously some of it's luck of the draw and how many people get ahead of you in terms of being able to get that application in. Once we get the RFP done, typically you would allow firms to have probably approximately 3 to 4 weeks to basically put together their response. That's a fairly customary time frame for someone to develop a proposal and to get it in, which realistically would put us into that July time frame. I think to some degree, whether the timing associated with the Board of Public Works approval at that point somewhat becomes out of the city's control. It depends on what agenda it ended up on. So I think one of the questions, and I think it's what the mayor is alluding to, is if the council does not wish to, I guess, deal with that issue in terms of having to get the Board of Public Works approval due to timing or other considerations, one option the city could consider is to pledge its own funds, basically, to pay for the feasibility study. This budget does not contemplate that. It assumed that the program open space funds would be used. So that's really a matter that the council may want to have some discussion about.
I guess if we can get the approval in a timely fashion, it's certainly better to use the POS or other funds to do it. But I think if we go that route and they don't get to it in a timely fashion, that's going to push us, it's going to push our timeframes way back and get us in a bind farther on in terms of what we need to do for coming to some kind of decision about the gym. So I think we have to make that expenditure in a timely fashion, whether or not the Board of Public Works gets to it. So I think we have to be prepared to expend our own funds.
I'm going to, if I may, direct a question to Ms. Ludlow, who's a little bit more familiar with the Board of Public Works process than I am. Suzanne, when we're filing the application before the Board of Public Works, how detailed does that application have to be? In other words, would we need to have a specific cost for the feasibility study, or would we be able to put together a more generic application, for lack of a better way of describing it, talking about studies relating to the proposed construction of a gym and possible design costs?
Yeah. It doesn't have to be completely specific, especially at the earliest stage. Later on, you get more and more specific because you keep going back for the different stages. I think we have some flexibility on the initial application to the Board of Public Works.
Because if I can just point out that I think what we need to do is award that contract to somebody before our August break in order to get information back mid-September in order to be ready to deal with things like possible funds from the county supplemental, also to be ready to go forward with the state process after the first of the year.
Is there a sense, I would agree with Councilmember Williams' concern about moving this along and making sure that we get the information that we need in a timely fashion. And I'm assuming if we were to award the contract, say, in mid-July, would that, I mean, could we go before the Public Works in early July? Is that a feasible way, is that a feasible time frame for them to make a decision?
It's a little, I will need to double check with the person who works with the Board of Public Works agenda. They sometimes have time, they sometimes don't. What I would, there's several different stages in terms of the discussions with the Board of Public Works, and we would need to, before, we would need to have the contractor identified at a certain point because they'd have to approve the contract, the contractor. And so I think that time frame makes a lot of sense. It's a little bit close, but I think it certainly is something that we would strive for and could probably work with the sense that their agenda sometimes, is not within our control.
Do they preload their agendas? In other words, could we say toward the end of June, we want to be on your first agenda in July, and here's the information?
They certainly appreciate the information submitted in advance to get on their agenda, and they can add some additional information. Nevertheless, I've been on both sides of that. Sometimes they're hardline about it, and sometimes they're not. And so it would simply be kind of the luck of the draw on that.
One option, I mean, we certainly understand the concern. One option may be to go ahead at this juncture and leave the budget as it is. It gives Suzanne an opportunity to, I assume it's Barry Christie is who you're referring to, is to have some further discussions and, just kind of keep moving forward as we have more information. I mean, I think the question will become how much detail do they need to get the application kind of on their plate to review, and is it sufficient to sort of talk about a feasibility study, take our best guess at what we think such a study might cost. And I mean, I think if they're looking at the application in more of a conceptual view or level of detail, that's probably something we could put together. If they're looking for a specific amount and a specific contractor, that may be a little bit more difficult until the RFPs actually come in.
Right. Politically, we do have one thing working in our favor, and that is that the reason that we have these POS funds is that they're a high priority of the governor. additional funds were put in this year for the program Open Space. And so he does want to see these things move forward relatively quickly. So there's more push on that than normal.
Well, that would certainly be an advantage.
No, I'll pass.
Yes.
So I'm comfortable with leaving the budget as is for now, trying to push the process with the Board of Public Works, and if that doesn't work, having to do whatever is necessary in July to go forward anyway.
Yeah, I would just note that since the program open space funds have a 25% match, the budget as it stands right now, as I mentioned earlier, it reflects an operating transfer of 25% of the entire portion of the program open space funds. If for whatever reason we get to this juncture and the council decides it would rather use its own funds, quite frankly, a part of that operating transfer, instead of being the match for the POS funds, could just be used to pay for the study. Okay. So it wouldn't necessarily require a budget amendment immediately to move forward with the study. It would at some juncture if you went to expend the full amount of the program open space funds.
Okay.
Right. But if we spent it, would it count toward the match eventually?
No, sometimes prior expenditures are not counted.
Right.
And so even if it's in the, would otherwise meet the criteria, the mere fact that the expenditures have been made will disqualify them.
Okay, 'cause I've seen this before where sometimes money we've spent has been allowed to be counted toward things. So is this going to be one of those times when it's not going to be allowed to be counted toward things?
That should be our assumption.
Well, but my understanding is that if you go forward to the Board of Public Works and try and get monies that you've already expended some time back, but supposing we expended the money at the time we went to the Board of Public Works, and when we got approval for the project, we were, this was something that had happened like immediately before that. Couldn't we get that, or does it have to? Is it the point?
It's the point of the approval and the point of the expenditure.
And I would say that's a fairly customary practice with any type of grant. I guess if you try to expend anything before you actually have approval, in most instances you're not likely to get reimbursed.
Maybe we could just not hand the check over until we got the approval from the Board of Public Works. No, I'm serious.
My only concern, I guess, is I'm with Bruce in terms of moving this expeditiously, because if people are right about construction costs increasing at 15% to 20% a year in the current situation.
The current figure is 30%.
So that waiting a year or half a year on a project that's $1 million, I mean, we know the math, it's $300,000. So it'd be absolutely foolish to delay things and wind up costing ourselves a ton more money than it's already going to cost.
Yeah, I think depending on what kind of workload the Board of Public Works has, the timing may actually work quite well in terms of getting the RFPs in, hopefully getting fairly quick approval by the council and getting an application in. I think they usually meet about twice a month, Suzanne?
It's usually about that.
Right. So I think at this point, like I say, my recommendation would be just to kind of leave it as is and, let staff continue to have some discussions with Mr. Christie, and obviously just kind of keep moving the RFP process along.
Okay, if we could, I think there is a concern about the timing, and I think Mark is right. And, if it's going up 30% a year, that's, 2.5% a month, so it's not a small thing. Thank you. Does the council want to take a break at this point, or do you just want to keep on working and see how? I mean, we're scheduled to take a break before we take up the reconciliation issue. We're running about.
Short break.
All right. We'll take a short break and come back.
We weren't used to it because we were on time.
Just assume we were on time.
Well, people were like,
wasn't going to say that. The city manager has provided us, or the staff has provided us with if you look at the third page of the thing in the material that was at your desk, the third page is a list of all the reconciliation items and whether they are additions or reductions and the staff's approximate cost. This is a summary of the material they gave us. Notice you left something on our place. Is that different than what was in our packets?
Yeah, actually, if I can. What is before you is there were two cost numbers that just didn't get carried forward to the title heading section. That's the only difference in terms of the supplemental information sheet. I believe, Mayor, is what you're referring to.
I'm referring to this one.
Yeah, it's the same that was in your packet, except there were two figures that were actually in the text of a particular section but didn't get carried forward to the title. So I was just trying to be more precise.
Okay, all right.
Other than that, it's exactly the same.
Can I ask one frustrating question?
Certainly.
I'm used to looking at this and saying, taking our current budget, with any of your adjustments, you know, for example, the health care and other stuff,
right,
and your tax rate, and then being told that we're either over where you were or under where you were. And so now I'm looking at, a sheet that has additions and subtractions, but they don't include some of the things you've told us about, so I don't know whether...
It does. If I can,
Okay.
Before you all start this, can I just make a few introductory comments, because Councilmember Elrich just was trying to find my way to nose myself in there, Mark, and you just handed it to me. Thank you. Councilmember Elrich is correct, and we talked about there have been some changes prior to whatever decisions you choose to make this evening. If I can just kind of call your attention to the three-page, first page is the general fund balance projection. This was a document that had been given to the council previously, but has been updated. And what I want to call your attention to is the projected fund balance as of June 30th, 2007. That has changed, and you'll see in the footnote, from the original document that was given to you when we started this process back in early April, the estimated fund balance as of June 30th of 2007 is now estimated to be approximately $282,000 less than when we first started out. And there's three primary components to that. One is the elevator cab installation, which, as you recall, is about $180,000. One is the increased cost of employee health insurance, which for the general fund is right around $63,000. It's actually detailed on the second page. And then the third component is the police car allowance, which is $37,700. So kind of as a starting point for the discussions you have this evening, all those three items which the council previously discussed or gave some direction to, those are already built into the budget as a starting point for your deliberation.
So let me get clear.
Okay.
So you dealt with those items by changing the fund balance, not with raising the tax rate or making...
Correct.
That's what I was confused about.
Yeah, and if I can just...
And that was the same question I had this afternoon.
Right. But that, part of the reason I want to mention is this budget was predicated basically on a tax rate of 63 cents per $100 of assessed valuation. Everybody knows that. What I tried to do on the second page of the same handout is take you from, if you went to your budget binder figure, we started out with general fund expenditures of roughly $17.4 million. On that second page, it's a detailed listing of every change that has been made to the 07 expenditures to get you to the current figure of $17.6 million. Some of that is, you won't see the elevator here because basically that's an operating transfer, so it's not actually a general fund expenditure. It affects fund balance. But this will basically carry you from the number you started with back in April to the number that's before you this evening. And if the general fund summary page that's included in the agenda packet, if you flip to that, all the numbers tie. So if you now look at general fund expenditures as revised as of this evening, it's going to be the $17.6 million. And I was just trying to walk you through how you got there. With those changes, you're correct, Councilmember Elrich, nothing has changed with the tax rate. But I am trying to point out that there have been some changes that are going to basically hit this budget, particularly the car allowance and the cost of employee health insurance, that we're trying to absorb within the proposed tax rate. So I'm just kind of suggesting that that be kept in mind as you go forward with your deliberations this evening. The third page...
But they're not in here yet? You said they're going to hit this budget. They're not in here yet?
All those items that I've mentioned, the health insurance, the elevator, the car allowance, those are already built in.
Okay.
Basically, I assume, based on prior council discussion, I mean, we've obviously made some commitments to the police union. We have to pay for our employee health insurance, and we've given notice to TRG for the elevator. All the other things that the council asked to be put on the budget reconciliation list are on page 3. Those are basically up for grabs in terms of what you all choose to do with them, and depending on what those decisions are, you know, that may or may not impact the tax rate.
Can I just ask one additional question? In the first set of materials we got, you had, as of looking again at this first page, general fund balance projection, you have a total, as of June 30th, 2007, estimated a total unreserved fund balance of $1.784 million. Now you're projecting a total unreserved fund balance of $1.565, et cetera. You told us when you first presented the budget figures to us that you were comfortable that the fund balance that we had put the city in good shape. With a fund balance of unreserved fund balance of et cetera, 56581, are you still comfortable that we are in good shape with that fund balance?
Yes, I am. Obviously, the one thing, and just as a reminder, that these fund balance calculations assume that the contingency accounts, as I refer to them, I think the vernacular is consistently used as either the general contingency account, which is sometimes referred to as the city manager's contingency account, or the unappropriated reserve. As you know, those are budgeted items. The fund balance figure that is before you basically just kind of washes it out as an expenditure, assuming those funds are not touched in any way or, you know, not touched in their entirety. This figure would actually be higher than what these balance projections would show. I'm very comfortable with that. I think, as I stated when we first talked about the fund balance, which I guess was 2 weeks ago from this evening, I think the bigger concern, I think, as the council looks at expenditures, are those things that are going to be ongoing expenditures versus one time. They obviously have different impacts. But yeah, I am comfortable. If I was not, I never would have suggested you move forward with the elevator cab installation, for instance, if I thought it was going to cause financial problems.
Thank you. Colleen and then Terry.
I have a question, and then I wanted to pull some things off of the list. I wanted to do that first so we didn't have to bother to go through and talk about it.
Okay.
So maybe that's just put my microphone closer. The money for the pedestrian safety, is that all of our sidewalk money? It doesn't also include things like our speed bumps and things like that. It's not all traffic calming of that. It's just sidewalk, pedestrian safety stuff, right?
That's correct.
Okay.
Typically, speed bumps have been absorbed in the Public Works, operating budget. Usually you get a few petitions a year. The money, Councilmember Clay, that was specifically set aside, which FY06 was the first year we did that, for pedestrian safety measures, was in response to some discussions I was having with the council shortly after I started in terms of wanting to commit more funds and perhaps look at different options than just speed bumps.
Okay, great. Under traffic calming measures in Ward 2, aside from the Elman-Lincoln, Elman-Auburn option that is, as you heard tonight, important to people, the Jackson Avenue activity that is in the second paragraph there under traffic calming measures in Ward 2, and the Long Branch, Sligo folks are interested in going forward with the traffic surveys that, the money that we have for traffic studies, in part because they sort of recognize the impact that it has across boundaries and want to wait for a more professional process to assess that. And one example relates to your ward, Bruce, where I actually got a call from somebody in your ward asking about what Jackson Avenue was interested in between Lincoln and Sligo, because they were interested in some traffic calming there along Lincoln and that end, and how it might affect the circulation patterns if Ward 2 were to go forward without your folks being involved in the process and everything. And so I think there's a real interest on the part of those areas, and even across in the Forest Park area, about how it's going to be a more coordinated approach, and they're ready to wait for that. So we hope that that'll happen. But then
those will come off of the list here.
Yeah, if I can just add that that's kind of the reversal in direction of the way the prior studies and implementation went when the main impetus was from folks on my side of Jackson, and as it moved along, it incorporated extensive input from Saska to make sure that what was called the Manor Circle traffic study and implementation, that there was input from Saska.
Sure. Because
So,
I think as we heard tonight, the closing of Manor Circle and then the no right turn onto Jackson is really impacting Elm and Lincoln. So the holistic approach, people are getting it. So the other one is under the paving of Palmer Lane. I spoke to the city manager about this today, so maybe she has more to say. But those folks are really interested in addressing the stormwater first. And when we talked about, the cost to pave and then have to go back and do the stormwater, they also understood that it might be best to move forward with stormwater. I'm assuming we can do that with the existing activities that we have. And then the other issue is that this was inadvertently, I think, left off of the street study because they didn't realize that it was a street and that we had control over. And so if the stormwater gets addressed and then it becomes time to pave it, it will be assessed. And the thought is that when it's assessed, because it's never been paved,
It will end up probably at the top of the
it's going to
list.
go up to the top of the list, which is going to push everybody down slightly, but it's a street that's never been paved. So I think also we can drop this off of the list. And then the last issue, I was hoping maybe someone might know more about it, but it's the pathway lighting, the mural project in Ward 2. Would like to refer that to the Arts and Humanities Commission and go back to that process then before we seek some funding in this process here. So I'd like to pull that for this year. And the pathway lighting in Ward 2, I'm wondering, Sarah's here, maybe she might know, what's the trigger for ADA improvements? If we put pathway lighting in there, do we trigger ADA, and do we have to have a 5-foot wide path, and does it have to be accessible with ramping and all of that kind of thing? Or can you put in lights without triggering the ADA? I know there's a threshold. I don't know what it is for public works issues, though. You don't know the answer.
I can certainly address that with the Public Works Director. You probably have more expertise in this area, Councilmember Clay, than I do.
My impression is it wouldn't.
That's my impression as well, but we would probably need to verify that.
And I brought up the issue because improvements to that path were brought up, I'll say 5 years ago, when there were some improvements to the other piece of the path on the other side of Goody. And the tentative plans that came forward from our Public Works Department indicated that whatever was being contemplated at that time would require ADA implementation, and it basically blew the project out of the water.
And were they just, they had already had lighting, though? They were talking about, like, paving it or?
No. This was the part between Poplar and Goody was done. But it was, okay, what can happen with the other piece, the one that you're talking about? And there were even plans that were drawn, and all of it required ADA, and it made it so long and so convoluted and was going to tear up half the woods to do it.
But maybe by doing the first half, and it's been time has passed, maybe we'll be under the threshold.
Yeah, I mean, I can certainly confirm that Braithwaite is out of town visiting her family. She was obviously aware of this request. I spoke to her yesterday in terms of getting the pricing. She's certainly very familiar with ADA requirements, and at no time did she flag that as a concern. I would certainly like the opportunity to revisit that with her and just confirm that. But I believe if she had any immediate concerns, she would have voiced them.
Okay. Well, then I would like to leave that there.
Okay. What I was going to suggest a process by which we do this discussion, but if were you interested in taking something off the list, Joy?
I have a general question.
I was. Okay. And let's start off with taking things off the list, and then that might make the discussion easier. Yes.
Then I did have a question after that. The grant writer, I'm satisfied with the explanation of that, and I think that should be taken off the list.
Okay.
The council training, that's an issue that I'm surprised to see that costing out is necessary, given that I thought there was a certain amount put in the budget to cover council travel to certain prescribed events?
There is, and let me explain, Councilmember Osling, what maybe I was attempting to do, and I guess I shouldn't say we since it was me, is to give you all an idea. I mean, this is ultimately just a policy decision of what the council chooses to do. What I was trying to do is give you all some idea. If we took what we put in the budget, and for budgeting purposes, we do tend to assume that, each and every one of you may choose to go to both of the MML conferences. Obviously, one option the council could consider is just to say that each council member, I'm not endorsing this, I'm saying it's a possibility, that, has a allocation of $2,000 to use as each council member chooses to do so regarding training. So the only reason that figure was included was to give you some sense of what our assumption is in budgeting, how that would break out per council member, more for informational purposes.
Okay, so right now it is a $2,000 budgeted item, and then the council could decide to make that flexible or
certainly
only funding
for... That's just the underlying assumption when we come up with the budgeted figure.
Since it is not a budget item, or since it doesn't have an impact on the budget, I might suggest that we have that discussion at a later time rather than this evening. Okay.
I'm fine with that, too. Let's see. Flipping back and forth here, the materials that you provided both in advance and tonight are very useful, so I appreciate that you pulled this information together. I am struggling to review it carefully enough to make good decisions here, but two things I want to say. The code enforcement officer discussion that was in the council packet, that raised issues that I'm not exactly sure have been fully fleshed out. Is that something that
I think if we're going to decide on a position, we have to put it in the budget. So I think we will probably have to have that discussion this evening, but I anticipate that we probably, whatever issues you have concerns about, we can discuss in that context.
Well, what I would appreciate is on that particular item, I'm inclined to support the code enforcement efforts. What I want to make sure of is that we looked as thoroughly as we need to through the 5 pages that Sarah Daines put together. And could we have that as maybe a starting point, just getting a little bit of a briefing on that?
Yeah, actually, how we move through these, I think, depends on the council. My assumption was, and I would certainly encourage the council, is some of those items that are probably more costly one way or another would maybe be where you would start talking about the positions or the largest dollar amounts, and quite frankly, I'd like to get you all talking about those while you're still a little fresher in case the evening starts to drag on a little bit.
But I think the process of taking things off the list is a good place to start.
Okay, now the thing that I was wondering about on the Gardens Division, is that to be determined, the cost of?
Well, I think, Councilmember Austenling, that was more a question on my part. I know you had expressed some concern about making sure there were adequate resources. I didn't know if you had a specific dollar amount in mind. What I tried to do in the agenda packet is, I guess, put in perspective how the proposed FY07 budget compares to the resources provided for the Gardens Division in FY06, whether or not in the council's judgment that's adequate. Obviously, in my judgment, it was adequate because it was my proposed budget. I did not know if you had any specific dollar amount in mind, or you just wanted to discuss the Gardens Division. That's the only reason it said to be determined.
Okay, so it's not a specific dollar amount. It's really that weeds have not been pulled on Carroll Avenue. That's mainly what it is. We put in streetscaping on Carroll Avenue in one block. Weeds have not been pulled. Whatever is needed to make sure that that area looks tidy now that it's so beautifully reconstructed needs to be covered. And maybe it already is in the fiscal year 07 proposed budget. But that's the problem that I've heard about for the last, 4 or 5 months, and I think we don't want to come up short on some of these projects that have such widespread community support.
That information is helpful.
So that Gardens Division, I'm inclined to take it off the list so that it simplifies our discussion. And let me see here.
Go on.
Okay, the charge for police reports, that's minimal revenue loss, so is that something we need to discuss?
Yeah, I think we should discuss it. My understanding is it's not here because it's such a small amount they couldn't
Well, and it really
determine what
wasn't
it
an
was.
expenditure item. It's really not a matter that are spending something. It's a matter of foregone revenue.
Right, but
So-
my understanding from the write-up was that they weren't able to determine the amount of foregone
I think that's
revenue.
correct. Ms. Brooks may want to address this. I think she took a look at where revenues from police reports were getting booked, and it appears to be minimal, so if that's something the council feels more comfortable with. Truthfully, I don't even think it probably warrants going in and tinkering with general fund revenues. It's probably just not that significant of a fiscal impact.
Okay, so those were my questions. Thank you.
Terry?
Thank you. And again, I'm afraid I'm revealing a slow pace tonight. I'm still back in kind of the budget discussion that we had earlier that we thought we had just closed, and I'm trying to reopen.
That's okay.
And, I was trying to be sensitive to your comment earlier that, we really need to think about the ongoing costs, not just the one-time costs that we face. And I wonder in here, where in the budget does it reflect the cost of electric and also for gasoline, since those are items that are really escalating?
It is in the Public Works Department budget.
It's an operating expense, but I didn't
Yes,
see.
it is. I think if you look at, if you can bear with me one moment, Councilmember Siemens, I apologize. I can give you the specific figures, but on the kind of budget at a glance for the Public Works Department, which would be in your binder, well, supplemental handouts, I guess it depends what you did with it, but utility cost, I can pull that exact figure for you if you'd like.
Actually, I've got the page. It says $41,537.
Well, that was actually the increase in that particular category.
Right.
If you can give me just one moment, Councilmember Siemens, I'd be happy just to give you that number.
Thank you.
For electric cost, it's $130,000. Gas is 45. This is building, fuel. Heating, gas. 45,000.
This is budgeted amounts?
Yes, budgeted amount. $9,000 for water. And that's all in the building maintenance.
And then, of course, I was also thinking about gasoline for the vehicle.
Right, that's in the equipment maintenance division, and the figure for that, which would, this is for gasoline, is $80,000, and for diesel, it is $60,000. Did you want any comparative figures, Councilmember Siemens, for that? Or?
No, I can
Okay.
do that. I'm just concerned that we're basing this on what price. Since these prices are escalating so fast, the electric was based before or after the recent price increase?
I believe it was the recent price increase, and as a reminder, I'm probably going to get the terminology wrong, but we have some kind of cooperative agreement with Montgomery County in terms
Based
of...
on those actual, they just signed a new contract.
Just signed a new contract,
So
and
that's
actually...
based on actual cost.
Right. I think
Estimated cost.
I think those...
Usage may change.
Right,
Because I
sure.
don't think with the new building, we have a firm grip on what the usage is.
Right.
So you're saying we've got a certain amount of lock-in?
We've got a fixed price contract.
Yeah.
Correct. And I think that contract was just executed within the last 30 to 45 days.
That's for the
so
gasoline?
That was
No,
for
that's
that was
for
electricity. The
We
gasoline-
also do a COG general agreement on gasoline, so we're buying quite a bit lower.
I can ask Councilman Simmons, I'm looking at the figures, and it appears that the gasoline figure, and like I say, unfortunately, Ms. Braithwaite had a previously scheduled trip. It appears that she made some assumptions because we buy, we're not necessarily buying gasoline at, like what you and I would necessarily pay for going up to the Shell station or whatever. It looks like what she did is she factored in a certain amount with the city's, kind of cooperative purchase of gasoline, kind of buying in bulk, if you will, and then some in case people had to go up to the pump. That figure that she has Exxon 700 gallons. she's reflecting 260, which is obviously low comparing with what we're looking at. That's a relatively small amount of what she's requested, though, of that 80,000. That's only about $1,800 of it. The other pricing appears to be, because we're buying under some type of agreement where you're going to get cheaper than retail rates. She has a figure in here of is 46,200 gallons at $1.50 to $1.90 mid-range, which would be apparently what we're purchasing at discounted rates. Her assumption for diesel was at $2.40.
All right. All right, thank you.
Sure.
I guess I'd like to suggest a rough balancing act here. And that involves the police positions. I understand that in order to look at the police positions correctly, we have to assume that it's going to cost $70,000 in overtime. I think that's what you told me.
Sorry, I'm a little distracted by the Diet Pepsi. I just poured all over the place. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, you had said earlier.
Just talk generally for a minute.
I believe Councilmember Siemens went to retrieve paper towels. Thank you for your indulgence.
We've had a fuel spill.
Is that decaf or not decaf?
It's moving like the Exxon Valdez spill. Sorry about that. Go ahead, Councilmember.
Okay, so
focus a little more here.
So what I was looking at was taking the funding for vacant police positions and reducing the funding by $130,000 because I know you're going to have to spend, that it's going to increase the overtime expenditure.
Correct.
And you told me 70, but you also pointed out that we'll be losing a very expensive position for a short period of time. And so I'm figuring 66 ought to about cover it. So I would leave 130 as a cut on the, well, not a cut, but 130 for the savings for the police positions. And I would put
I think that's correct. The one thing I would just mention as we sort of started off talking about this is obviously the budget, certain assumptions were made by me in putting together the budget. In the case of the police department, since that's sort of a specific focus of your question, we've got car allowances of roughly $38,000, and the police department obviously is the largest city department in terms of that $60-some thousand for health insurance picked up about $20,000. Right. So you already have, from the time the budget originally got underway, probably an increase in police department expenditures of roughly $58,000 off the start. I'm just trying to get a sense of kind of, I think where you're headed is sort of the carrying capacity of the tax rate and that. Okay.
No, I'm not headed there.
Okay.
I'm trying to balance assuming that I didn't want to change anything else in your budget. I'm trying to balance proposed reductions against proposed additions. Okay. And so what I'm saying is, let's take a proposed reduction of about $130,000 in police expenditures, which nets out the overtime.
Right. So you're taking $196,000, which is 3 times the 65,370.
68 something other, actually, what it turned out today.
You're scaling it back to take into account some of the
overtime, because we'd have to.
I think that would be fair.
So I'm saying that we would save 130, and with that 130, and with saving 6,000 from the code enforcement officer, I'm assuming I would keep the code enforcement officer in here. But I agree with your proposal to redefine the position.
Correct.
It's about 7,000. So it's about $137,000.
That's correct.
And with the 137, fund the Safe Tacoma Initiative, the Elm Lincoln traffic calming, the Jobs Readiness Workshop, the HDI request, and the defibrillator. And that roughly balances 137 against 137. So that's 137 up, 137 down. And then those are the positions I'd like to keep, and I'm open to discussing the code enforcement officer and the gateway signage, which I would kill in a heartbeat if I had 3 votes. But other than that.
Well, can I make a suggestion that we actually take a little bit more of a look at some of these other things? I wouldn't be ready to just say, okay, just chop them and let's go home. Let me make a suggestion as to the way we deal with this. My sense was, in terms of last night or Monday night, that there was a fair amount of consensus on funding the Safe Tacoma Initiative. Right. Am I right about that?
And I said not sure. Yes.
Okay. So if we can just sort of say yes to that one,
I'm sorry, which one was that?
And
The Safe Tacoma
Can I
Initiative.
just specify that part of that Safe Tacoma initiative is guaranteeing 6 months of operating expenses for the C-Safe program?
Let's just leave it the way it is right now, and then talk about exactly where that goes later, okay? Because we're in the middle of a budget thing. And let me just go from there to what you put on the table was sort of the funding for the 3 vacant police positions. And you're saying that it would offset about, what did you say, 66,000?
No.
Overtime. Yeah, you're saying 196
minus 66
is 130.
130.
Okay.
Plus redefining the code enforcement officer gets you another 6.
Right, but let's just start with the 3 vacant police positions first. Are there comments on that particular proposal?
Agree.
Okay.
Redefining the code enforcement officer to save the $7,000.
I guess on that one, I guess I'm still not convinced as to why it needs to be a full-time position.
Can we have the code enforcement presentation, some briefing, so that we...
Okay, no, I think we need to have a bit more of a conversation on that. And what is it you want more than what's in the materials that we got?
You know, I've had about 2 hours of
Well, I think
holding
it's not
this
unreasonable
and
to say
really
that
not
we'd like
very
to
much
talk
time
about this and
reading
not
it,
just
so
shop it.
It's not
it would be
unreasonable,
great
but we don't
if
have to
someone
talk
could go
about
through
that.
the 3
highlights.
options
Sure.
to make sure that we've got the high points.
Sure. I mean, we're happy to do that if that's okay with the rest of the council. It is a lot of information. There were, some very good
Well,
questions.
it's welcome information.
Right.
Some
very good
transferring
questions have
property
been
maintenance inspections to the county was one that
Right.
I was surprised by, and yet it's interesting to see what it costs us to do it in-house and what revenue we get from it, as well as the other 2 options that were explored. I really appreciate that all being here.
Sure. Mayor Porter, are you okay if Sarah can just kind of do a quick briefing on this? Okay.
Sure.
Good evening. When the code enforcement position was initially discussed during the HCD's budget work session, there were a number of comments that were made and some suggestions in terms of how that might be revisited. One was to go back and look at the possibility of contracting out for commercial inspections. The other was to turn the whole thing over to the county. And then the third was to look at it from a more of a clerical perspective.
Less expertise. I mean, we didn't need to hire a code enforcement officer to do all the things that person was doing.
Right, which would be a clerical position. And then we had also added the possibility, from staff's, after staff looked at it, we also looked at the feasibility of reconfiguring or restructuring the position. When I spoke with Montgomery County regarding the possibility of contracting for services for commercial properties only, they costed that out at $120,000 a year. The first year is a little high because there are some equipment needs that would have to be addressed. But basically the staffing costs and the administrative and overhead costs associated with that position would be $100,000, which in subsequent years would increase in accordance with the cost of living, for example. The $20,000 would be for the initial purchase of a vehicle, and that would go away the second year.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Can you tell me what they, right now they're complaint-driven on commercial inspections, isn't that right?
This would be for them to go out and do commercial property inspections, similar to what we do for the rental housing. So they would go out and inspect roughly 200 commercial properties every year.
But it's not something they do in the county?
They do it on they do it on a couple of different levels. They will do it on what they call their Main Street approach, whereas if they're out inspecting one property and they notice the one next door or 2 doors down needs to be inspected, they will inspect that. They will do commercial property inspections on a targeted basis. Wheaton, Long Branch, for example, and there are a couple of other neighborhoods that they do targeted enforcement of. And then they do it on a complaint basis. So there are different levels. but there is no specific effort to go out and inspect every commercial property in Montgomery County on an annual basis.
Right. Okay, so the experience that the county inspectors would be bringing to this would be either from the complaint-driven approach or the targeted area approach. It wouldn't be the blanket approach where every commercial establishment gets inspected. And what's being proposed with the $58,000 is that. Do I have that right?
Yes.
Terry?
Yeah, and I think I'm following along the same lines of thought that Councilmember Austin Lane, and that is, if this is a service that's provided by the county for the rest of the county, it seems kind of outrageous to pay $100,000 and some for it here. It seems like, you know, we just need them to do the job and target an area that has that needs special attention at this time.
You could do that if you transferred over all of the licensing and the property maintenance code responsibilities to the county, which is the second option that starts in the bottom of page 2.
Right, which is for the commercial properties.
That would include everything.
It sounds like it includes residential and commercial.
Residential, commercial, rental, residential, vacant properties, everything.
And then we would also turn over to them licensing, and they would get the licensing fees.
Right now, the county...
I can't see that they would complain about us taking out the rental housing out of that, though.
So you're talking about us then assuming responsibility for the rental housing inspections and then giving them back the commercial?
No, I'm sorry. We would give them, yes, we would turn over the commercial licensing and code enforcement to the county, something that we don't get rebates for at this time, and the county would do it. And you know, it's just incredible that it's something that we do, and the county says it's going to cost them $100,000 and some to do, but we don't get a rebate for it. I mean, seems to be, I'm confused again.
We don't do what we want to do, what they don't do, and that's the trade-off you'd have to deal with here. I mean, for example, when Doug was talking about, and if you turn over everything, it's everything. So when Doug was talking about the residential properties in his ward, it would all be complaint-driven. There would be none of this, why don't we have a proactive inspector going around and staying on top of these properties and getting it done. It'll be, if somebody calls in, one of the 18 county inspectors will go out at some point and do something. I mean, I think there's not a lot of happiness in general with county's commercial code inspection. Lots of complaints about county commercial properties. It's treated very...
A lot of complaints about ours.
Well, we're not doing the commercial. But if the county does it, I don't know that we're going to get what we want. We'll give up any ability to do it, but we may not get what we want. I mean, telling people that it's just going to result in better enforcement of the code, I don't think it necessarily means that. And telling the county you need to make New Hampshire Avenue a target area doesn't mean they're going to make it a target area. I mean, on the housing code enforcement, we get right now somewhat special treatment because they're doing it with Long Branch. But you got to remember, the county's regular housing code enforcement is 1/3 of the units every 3 years. If if we weren't a target, and if they were to decide that we don't feel like targeting you now, then we'd fall back to a code inspection regime that we felt was really inadequate when we had it before. So I don't know that you get what you want out of the deal if we give it to the county.
Can I ask a question about this idea of transfer? What would you see as a potential timeline if the city council said that was something we wanted to see explored? That would still take a matter of, what would you estimate in terms of time?
The process is fairly straightforward from what I understand. You basically have to approve you have to rescind 2 specific chapters of Title VI, the licensing section and the property maintenance code section. And then because those local laws no longer exist, then the county laws override it, and the county then becomes responsible for it. And as a result of that, then it's all the county's procedures and regulations and county staff.
Now, how would we do a proactive commercial inspection program in addition to, if we rescinded everything, how would we then have a proactive?
You would not.
Is there any way to have code that specifies that we would be doing this adjunct activity?
No, because then you would have to adopt a property maintenance code inspection, which, because the county has it, means then the county steps aside and takes, the local jurisdiction takes over.
Sarah, let me ask the question, which is probably, it's more of a political process. Let's say we transferred everything over, but we wanted that focused attention. I assume that would, through whatever process, probably through political lobbying, the city would need to be requesting that the New Hampshire Avenue corridor becomes a targeted focal point for the county. And that generally comes down to, basically getting into the process early in terms of lobbying, because in order to do that, in addition to its other areas, the county may or may not need to add staff. I'm not going to pretend to know what their, excess capacity may be, but I'm assuming that's the way it would be done if it's no longer under our control, is putting pressure on the county that this is an important corridor that needs special attention, just like Wheaton or Long Branch or wherever their other targeted areas are. Is that correct?
Correct, and there are financial implications with that as well.
Because there are financial implications with the housing code, because we're getting more intensive housing code. The county's charging us for the more intensive. So if you look at this, and if we do away with it all, we net out $34,000. But if the county turned around and said, you want proactive, we'll give you proactive, that means another inspector. Instead of saving $34,000, we might be back to paying for an inspector again. So it's not clear that
that's
you
possible.
save any money at the end of the day.
It would depend, I guess, how much pressure, for lack of a better word, or influence you could, have on the county in making the political argument that it is part of the county and deserves the same attention. The county could take the position that if you want it, you pay for it. But it would obviously be, as Sarah's pointing out, it would be under their codes.
I think that if I could just make a follow-on point to that. In the past, we have had better luck at getting county participation on a one-time or funded basis. We need this much funding for this particular service at this time than we have had in getting them to provide services on an ongoing basis. And as Mark pointed out, the problem that we had in the past was that the kind of inspections that they were doing weren't up to the standards that we wanted to maintain. And we can put pressure on them, but, we have a much easier time getting them to make a commitment to a specific thing, like a sum of money at a particular time, than we do to maintaining a higher level of service over a long period of time. Terry?
Thank you, Mayor Porter. I have just two other questions regarding code enforcement. One is, does this estimate include any anticipated increase in the legal fees that will be a result of having stricter code enforcement?
No, these are purely staffing costs.
Right, and I again remind my colleagues of my earlier concern in this budget process that we look at things through a keyhole rather than look at the holistic projects as we try to assess the budget impact. The other thing is, as I understand from a recent email this week, that the current code enforcement officer is doing like half time on rental housing licensing, and yet, just as recently as last Monday, we were talking about the need for more code enforcement, and that we had one full-time code enforcement officer, and now it sounds like if that's only a half-time person, that maybe we already have the code enforcement officer we need. We just need a different workload.
I don't necessarily agree with that. I think that the case for additional staffing that we control is a fairly strong one, and it has been made in a very articulate way by a number of citizens on Monday night. They certainly agree that additional staffing that we control is necessary. I believe the city staff would endorse that. Please disagree if you don't feel that assertion is correct. I think the city manager has been clear that additional resources is needed for more staffing. The business community has made a very strong case for this on Monday night and again tonight, and I think we need to pay particular attention to what they have said they need, because there is an indisputable connection between the ability to attract investment to an area in need of revitalization and the condition of that area. If it looks bad, if it's blighted, the investment isn't going to come. Now, the question is, what do we get for our $58,000? I submit that we get more and better residential inspections, which we need. We will get more and better commercial inspections, which we need, because we have virtually none now. And we'll get more and better oversight of the rental inspections, which, as we know, are now done under contract by the county. So I would again ask my colleagues to support this item in the budget, and let's move forward.
I was supporting additional code enforcement work, but if we have a code enforcement officer only working half-time on that particular task, then maybe we already have the person and we're already paying the expense. We just need the person to concentrate on the work that is doing code enforcement.
Well, the question is, with the additional hours that she would be freed up to do in what she's already doing, which, by the way, are connected. The things that she does for the rental inspections, as I understand, are connected with what she does. Will that provide the additional hours to do all of the things I've just said? And I submit to you, even if she were on the street all the time, we still would not have the inspection that we need.
Let me just point out that the information that we received from the department indicates that the current inspector spends about 45% of her time doing rental housing licensing, about 30% doing code inspections, and the other 25% doing oversight of the county's code inspection, rental housing code inspection process. So I think that there is some time that could be freed up if the rental housing licensing program were moved to another individual. Now, we don't have another individual available right now, so that would mean that somebody would have to be hired. I would agree with what Doug is saying. I think we need to do a better job with the property maintenance inspections, and it would be good to see some commercial property maintenance inspections also. But I guess I'm not convinced that we need a whole nother code inspector to do that, because right now we have a person who is hired because of her qualifications as a code inspector, and yet she's spending the majority of her time doing something, 70% of her time doing something other than code inspections. And I think if we were to rearrange that particular position so that the code inspector does code inspections pretty much full time, and then we move the other 50, 70, whatever percent of her time to someone else who doesn't necessarily have to be a qualified code inspector, but who is nonetheless able to do those other functions, which I don't think of them as clerical. I don't think the rental housing licensing is clerical. I think there's some research and things that have to be done. I think we could do this for 1+ people, 1+ something less than a whole nother person, and we could get the additional, if we just freed up her time and she went from 30% to 100% doing code inspections, that would be more than 3 times the code inspections she's doing now.
I think the flaw maybe in that is that if this report's also right, that inspectors spend about 30% of their time doing paperwork, we'd see her spending 70% of her time instead of 30% of her time, so another 40% is another 16 hours a week. And I guess the question is whether you think another 16 hours a week is going to be adequate to do the number of inspections that we would like to see done, both commercial and residential.
I assume that 30% includes the paperwork associated with the code inspections. But what it said is she spends 45% of her time doing the rental housing licensing process. She spends 25% of her time overseeing the rental housing licensing contract, and 30% of her time doing code inspections. And I'm assuming that that 30% includes whatever paperwork is associated with code inspections. So otherwise, she's spending more than 100% of her time, which seems rather unlikely.
There are a couple of challenges we have at the moment. Is that the rental housing licensing program is very involved in relationship to other jurisdictions. If you look at the code and you look at the requirements that must be satisfied prior to a license being issued, it's about twice as long as most anywhere else. So there is a lot of interaction with the property owners, with other agencies within the organization and outside agencies to make sure that all of those little checks that we have to mark off have been complied with before we can actually issue a license. So it's not just paperwork. It is interacting with state agencies, with the landlords, with...
Right, but does she have to be a licensed code inspector to do that?
What we had proposed when we had talked about this at the earlier work session is to restructure that so that a lot of that information or a lot of that paperwork and documentation could be reduced and then would be able to transfer over to another individual, which would free up some of Margie's time. There are still a lot of things, however, that are very technical in nature, especially when you're dealing with the State Department of the Environment, that I would hesitate to turn over to a program assistant. The other thing that I'd like to point out is that the work that, if we were to hire a person to do the paperwork and do the research, it would have to be someone who would be at the same level as our program assistant, which is what that person helps out with now. Because of the reclassification efforts that we made with the code enforcement inspector, that new person would be hired at the same level as the inspector, so there would be no cost savings there. The program assistant who does all the paperwork and all of the does extensive amount of paperwork as well as community interaction is a grade 28, or no, excuse me, a grade 26. We have reclassified the inspector position that we're talking about to a grade 26. So it would be challenging to hire someone at a lower level than the program assistant and have that individual do the same work as the program assistant. So we'd be looking at having 2 program assistants. Is that?
So this is your third option that you have in your memo, and you're proposing a grade 26 person who would do some of the things that don't require a certified code inspector. That sounds
Correct.
Right to me.
What we're looking at doing is, because we no longer in 2002 we added the BOCA requirement at the council's urging, because we no longer do internal inspections of properties. Going back and reevaluating what our options might be, it was felt that that would no longer be a necessary requirement, because the inspections would be limited primarily to exterior and grounds. By doing that and then rewriting the job description, which would eliminate interior inspections, we were able to drop the classification of that inspection down 2 grades so that it is more affordable and is now at the same level as the program assistant who does a lot of the paperwork for all of the inspections.
But as I understand what you're saying, as part of that, though, I wanted to make sure that the code inspector's time was spent doing code inspections, and that the person who didn't have the same grade level as the code inspector, in other words, we're not using the certified inspector's time to oversee the rental housing licensing and then sending somebody who's not a certified code inspector out to do code inspections.
The code enforcement coordinator, Ms. Saccone, is responsible for oversight of that division. So one of her jobs is to oversee the functionality of that division, and the operations are going smoothly. So she would be overseeing it regardless. She would not turn it over to someone at a lower level and then never get involved in making sure that it's being done appropriately.
Okay.
She serves in a supervisory role.
Okay. And then the only other question, it seems to me, is the question of whether the second position is part-time or full-time. You noted that the problem that you note with a part-time position is that it's sometimes difficult to get good applicants for a part-time position. Is there another particular reason not to make it a part-time position?
It has an impact in terms of the amount of work that can be accomplished and the amount of time that they would actually be out in the field doing inspections. Because the new inspector will be doing paperwork. It's just a function of the position in terms of documenting what they've seen, following through and doing the citation, writing up the violation notices, etc. So the fewer hours they are in the office, using that as a part-time versus a full-time, the less time they would be out in the field.
I understand what Doug's concern is. I do think we need to do more inspections. I guess I'm not convinced that it needs to be full-time, but I would be willing to go with that if it were at the lower grade level, and if we made sure that the person who is doing the inspections is the code inspector, and we don't end up, I guess I'm still not sure why. I understand she's supervising that group of 2 or 3 people, but I still don't see why we don't send the code inspector out to do the inspections and have the people who are a lower level do the other stuff. But as long as that was happening, I would be okay with going with the, making the other position of 26 instead of 28.
I guess I want to say 2 things about that. One is that, I worked as an investigator, which is similar in terms of the nature of the work. You go out and you examine things, you have to write them up when you come back. And I would say it's really difficult to separate the write-up and some of the seemingly administrative parts from that activity. And the other thing is that I served also doing the reviews. I wasn't technically the supervisor, but I was the person who reviewed the work and the other investigations to see if we were going to provide payment, which it sounds like is maybe similar to what you're doing, is check the quality. And I think that you have to be qualified in the field to do that effectively. And the last thing I'm going to say, just in the interest of brevity, I won't go on, but I agree with everything that Doug said prior and support that. I think we should move forward with it as it is.
Let me just make a clarification again. I am not suggesting we separate the paperwork on the code inspections from the code inspections. I am suggesting that we separate the rental housing licensing program from code inspections and their paperwork. That's the separation I'm suggesting we make. Yes.
I am really intrigued by this, the ideas brought up by this memo, and I don't want to lose sight of the possibility of us getting county inspections in our city if that's possible. I think that what we've seen with the rental housing inspection is that we've gotten a big bump in quality, and we are able to direct the quantity, but I would want to see it phased in. I don't think we could do something that major without studying it for a while and maybe thinking about its impact on next year's budget. This year, I feel that the $58,000 price tag is a valuable investment for the city. This is because of problems that we're seeing in Ward 6, but it would really improve commercial areas all over the city. And when we tried to do this before, our business owners told us they couldn't afford an inspection fee. So, I think we need to bite the bullet and take care of our commercial areas, even if they're not able to ante up, as it were, to cover that cost. So I'm inclined from everything that's been said here to support the $58,000 full-time position, and I think that Colleen makes a good point about the paperwork and the inspection being linked. And I would hate to see us only have one inspector when people will be on leave from time to time, and we may need the other person to be an inspector so that we can take care of business on a daily basis. So that's where I am.
Let me just see a clarification, if I can sort of determine. It seems to me that there is council support for two positions. I guess the question that leaves is whether we go with the restructuring of the inspector position so that one is a grade 28 and one is a grade 26, or whether we keep them both at grade 28. The third option that the department put forward was to restructure the inspector's position, moving some of the requirements, some of the duties of that person to a person who would be a program, what did you call that? What was the name of the position?
We have a program assistant on staff now.
And then this would be the same level as the program assistant, but it would be someone with some qualifications as a code inspector, although not someone who's certified as our current person is. Right?
And I apologize if I'm being a little repetitive. Right now, we have the individual that oversees the division's activities. That is the code enforcement coordinator, which is a grade 29. I had misspoken in the memo. I had it down as a 30, but it's a grade 29.
Okay.
And they provide oversight of all the contracts and all of the staff, as well as do the inspections that we are able to do right now. This is what I'd like to see. We keep that position. We hire a code enforcement inspector. That's the title. And that would be at a grade 26? 26. And that individual's responsibilities would be to go do inspections. And we would keep our program assistant, which is also a grade 26, who does the paperwork, the clerical, the research, recognizing that those administrative responsibilities will still fall upon the code inspector and the code coordinator, albeit to a lesser extent.
And that's what would save $6,800.
It's a small amount, but it's
over the
6,000.
current budget.
Right.
Okay, I would be willing to go with that.
For this to work, however, we'll be coming back to you in a couple of months, I think, maybe, to talk about how the changes that we'd like to see in the licensing program that would streamline that process and put the code enforcement coordinator out on the street more frequently.
Right. That was what I was after, is the person at the higher grade level actually doing the inspections. So is there council consensus around that? That saves us the $6,000, $6,000 whatever it was. Yeah, okay. If there's consensus about doing that, then the only other personnel issue is the evidence officer that was proposed in the police department. What does the council want to do about that? You want to include the evidence officer?
We want to have an accredited police department.
What do you say?
I was inclined to say no.
No, I frankly don't understand why they can't keep things neat and organized by themselves, but it's kind of disturbing that things always got to go in there and organize the stuff after they put it away, and that things aren't where they were when they put them there, but if it has to be, it has to be. I just think that these are the kind of things that down the road, this is another permanent position, for something I thought could be done with the people who are there now.
My concern is that for quite a long period of time, there was one officer on light duty that was doing the job, and then we heard last week that the job wasn't done well. And it makes me wonder if it's really a shortage of staff or if it's a management problem.
Well, just to clarify, I don't think it was that the job was not done well, and it was certainly not a criticism of that individual. I think the actual statement was that counting on someone essentially being injured or ill does not, you can't necessarily count on that. And obviously we would hope that someone's not injured or ill and that it's a function that requires more consistent focus. I will say in every city I have worked in, there has probably been at least 50%. In these departments, they actually used a commissioned officer, so it was a much more expensive process. They probably had a detective where 50% of their time or more was dedicated to evidence processing. So my personal assessment, based on my professional experience, is that the department has identified a very cost-effective way of dealing with a very critical function in any law enforcement agency.
My recollection of our last discussion on this is that things weren't where they thought they should be. They had trouble locating things. And I know I've seen, received emails from constituents who have tried to retrieve property that took a long time for the department to find. And so that was what I was basing my feelings on.
Are you suggesting that, are you saying yes or no to that?
I was saying that no, I wasn't.
Okay, you were saying no.
Make
What
it
was-
brief, yes.
Go ahead, Bruce.
And my no was on a different basis. My no is mainly from trying to find ways to have some kind of reduction in the tax rate. And in order to do that, if we're adding things in, we've got to have reductions. We can't do everything. That's why I'm going there.
Okay, Colleen.
I remember that right after I came onto the council, there was a constituent of mine who made a request related to this. Would that be correct?
That's correct.
I was new at the time, so I didn't get all the
No,
elements,
you're
but-
correct.
But my understanding is that we spent, was it $680 of labor time just trying to assess a few months' worth of evidence processing, because we didn't, it wasn't something that you could just go to the file and pull, and doesn't that kind of point to the issue that we need a person to do this, or not?
If I may, the individual, your constituent who filed the PIA request, and certainly Chief Kramer or Captain Corsi can correct me if I'm wrong, the estimate that was provided to that individual in terms of the cost of processing his Public Information Act request had more to do with not that things weren't in the right place, but that the information that he was requesting in some instances had, for instance, the information would be available on a certain page, but because some of it was not public information, sheets would have to go back and be manually redacted. And he was requesting information, if I recall, for a fairly significant period of time. So a lot of it, Councilmember Clay, had to do with having to manually redact records to protect individuals' privacy for information that was not in fact public.
Okay. I think he didn't make his request very well then, because what he said back to me was that he thought that the papers that he was asking for were one-pagers that were part of what's required for an accredited organization. And he was, the reason why he was so surprised by the fee was because he thought it was just a matter of going through these materials that were already processed in the customary manner that they were supposed to be processed. But we don't have to go back to that.
So are you, what's your sense? Are you saying, yes, we do need this person, or no, we do not?
Well, I'm not, this isn't my profession, and so I have to defer to the city manager who put together the budget and the police chief who said that they needed the position, and that's the best I can do. I don't have any other additional expertise that would inform this in any other way.
Are there any other sort of council's feelings on this particular issue? Are you, where's the rest of the council on this?
I support it.
And you do also, Doug?
I'm willing to go along with it.
Okay.
I would really, I really hope that we get a chance to reevaluate the staffing of the department over the next year. I just think it's critical. I'm bothered by this for all the reasons I said in the beginning. On the other hand, every cop TV show I ever I saw when I went down to the evidence room, there was somebody who was in the evidence room assigned to be there, so there must be some universal truth.
What made you point that out to us?
So if TV is ever a reflection of reality, perhaps there's something.
It is, in fact, a reflection of reality, I will say that. I guess we could.
a few other requests.
But I'll point out the other things they do in the evidence room that you probably don't want repeated. So, I mean, there's a mixed bag here.
And then you have to have a makeup officer.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, so.
And I'll just say that I'm still a no.
Okay, I understand that. I think that was a close one. It seems like there's four keep it in the budget and 3 take it out. So that squeaked by. Okay.
Do you want to revisit the vote?
Huh?
Never.
No. And I guess in terms of the Elm Lincoln thing and the Boston Avenue sidewalk installation, let me make a suggestion. The council has put a priority on traffic calming, pedestrian safety, whatever you want to call it. At the same time, I guess I'm a little bit disturbed that this has become sort of a horse trading exercise rather than a sense of, the kinds of looking sort of holistically at what the problem is in the city and making decisions on the basis of what sort of citywide priorities are, like we do with streets. I think the process that we've set up with streets works very well. We have a professional assessment of the streets, which includes the condition they're in. It used to also include the amount of traffic they had, but it looks at various things having to do with the streets, and then we rank the streets. And rather than our sitting here saying, okay, I'll give your ward 10,000 for streets if you give me, 5,000 for sidewalks, what we end up doing is we do an assessment of the entire city, and then the streets get done in their priority order. I think we can do something like that with pedestrian safety and traffic calming. And if we put a sufficient amount into the budget, the people don't feel cutthroat. They don't feel like, I got to get my project in there because there's hardly any money there. If we allocated enough money in the budget for traffic calming, I think we could come up with something that was workable. And so that's sort of what I would suggest we do, rather than funding and with no disrespect for some of these smaller projects. I would suggest that we would go with the Historic Tacoma Archive request, which I think is only $5,000 and will give us a lot of useful information. And I guess on the other ones, I would say that we should put together a fund, a larger fund. Right now, there's $45,000 for pedestrian safety. Put some additional funding into that and have a sort of a citywide discussion of what we want to do in terms of making decisions for pedestrian safety.
I think we have a couple of different things in play here. One is traffic calming, which is directly on the roads, and we get an opportunity when someone's ripping up a road for us to do something. We ought to try to take advantage of it. The sidewalk issue, we've talked about and then avoided for almost as long as I've been in the council. And we've talked about having a sidewalk policy, and maybe this is the year that the council develops a sidewalk policy. We've talked about doing, long-term assessments to pay for sidewalks, because a lot of the original sidewalks weren't put in by the city. They were put in by the developers who built the developments. Some developments got built with sidewalks. Some got built without them. They weren't originally necessarily taken out of the taxpayers' pocket, though future maintenance is taken from taxpayers. So I would like to look both at what's the need and what are possible funding mechanisms, which we've avoided, and then what's a fair and equitable way of doing it, because I can pretty much guarantee you that, if we're talking on the order of $50,000 to $100,000, we will get nowhere near the sidewalk demands that exist in the city. And then in fairness to, for example, Colleen's ward, which is one of the wards which has raised sidewalks back when Kathy was there and when Ed was there, as vehemently as anybody. No one's ever gone through the planning process because they've always been told that you're not going to get a sidewalk until the city comes up with a plan for doing the sidewalks. And so I think that it behooves us to come up with a plan for how we're going to do sidewalks, figure out how to fund them and what's an equitable way to do them. I don't believe in the process of taking a pot of money and necessarily splitting it equally among wards, because I don't think that addresses the need in the city, and the city's too small and our wards are too small for us to be parochial and to say that, I'm entitled to $20,000 no matter what if somebody else has far greater needs than I have. I mean, when I was first on the council, there was a period of time when my ward got some pretty intensive road attention because the roads there were absolutely horrible. There are other places which have far worse roads than I have right now, and I don't feel compelled to demand that I get, my fair proportionate share of that when I know that other roads in the city are far worse than the roads in my ward. So I think, we've got to take kind of a holistic citywide look at this, since we have limited resources, and deal with it sort of the way we've tried to do with the roads. which is to say, what's the greatest need, what are the roads in the worst condition, rate these things objectively, and go down the list and serve people in a more objective manner. So my goal for the year would be, let's come up with a plan and the funding mechanism.
I just want to say one thing about the Elm-Lincoln traffic calming. As my colleagues know, I've been very eager to see traffic calming done in our city, and I was pleased to find out from Councilmember Clay that this has been vetted, it has been discussed, there is a concrete proposal on the table, and I would love to see this done over the next year. And I agree that there are many efficiencies when you do it at the time that other utility work is being done. So the amount that the Elm-Lincoln item looks to me it's coming out at is $42,000. Is that right?
Yeah, my impression from talking to people is that there's support for the traffic circle at the top and for the bump outs at the bottom. The bump outs are actually more expensive, which kind of surprised me, which would put them right at about $42,000. So, and I want to say also, are you done, Joy?
Well, the only thing I would add to that is I've been envious of the traffic circle on Gist Avenue, which is beautiful. And if you haven't seen it, I encourage you to drive down there because Silver Spring has it and Tacoma Park doesn't have it. And for us to do something creative and beautiful as well as calming traffic, to me, is perfectly in keeping with the spirit of Tacoma Park. So I think this is a great place to start with putting one in place. The one at the junction, I also think needs to be seriously looked at and funded as soon as possible. So, you know, maybe if the city of Tacoma Park has one on a smaller scale in place, when we talk about it in the junction, we can point to the one that's on Elm and Lincoln and say, that's what we're talking about when we propose this.
Yeah, let me say that, you know, I think in terms of the horse trading issue, we've taken all the other ones one at a time, so I think we should continue on with these one at a time. Also, you know, the city has been involved in laying out the various options for this over the past several weeks. The engineer's been out, the public works director has been out. People from other parts of the neighborhood have come over to check it out, in part to model what they think might be future options for them. I was actually really surprised that given all of the city's interaction with this and how closely I worked with the public works director, that it didn't end up in the budget to begin with. And, you know, I don't think it's an issue of we've got $45,000 in this budget, we have $25,000 going to Ward 6, and it's an issue of Ward 6 versus Ward 2. It's an issue that there's $45,000 in this fund, and here's an example. In Doug's ward, we have one, what's happening in that ward? It's like a sidewalk and other improvements to a single intersection is $25,000. This actually involves two intersections. So, you know, when we're talking about $25,000, $30,000 per intersection, and we've only got $45,000 in the budget, you know, we're not allocating enough as our traffic calming issues are getting greater and greater. I get tons and tons of calls for traffic calming. And I would say that if this doesn't come into the budget, that's going to be a real problem for Ward 2. And, you know, they're going to be back here talking to us about it. It's been in the pipeline for so long as far as the residents are concerned, that they were just kind of shocked that it didn't make it in.
I would say that's the same on Boston Avenue as well.
Yes, see, that's exactly the problem. You're going to get into these arguments.
I don't know, actually, this is not an argument. I see this budget as being very positive. I think we have many good things that we are accomplishing with it, not setting aside money to study where it's needed and think about it for a lot longer. It's like, get it done. We are putting money in the budget to get it done this year. That's exciting. I think this is a strong budget, and I don't think that we're horse trading up here. We're learning from our colleagues what they know are the priorities of their ward, and we are making sure that the city as a whole is best served by our budget.
The proposal, let me repeat, the proposal that I was making was to increase the essentially pedestrian safety, traffic calming, whatever we're going to call it, which is currently at $45,000 total in the budget. I think if, by my calculations, we could increase it to $100,000, which I think would cover the kinds of things that we're talking about. I'm just trying to avoid sort of saying, well, it's only going to go for this, this, and this, and suggest that we have that discussion at a later point.
I'd be comfortable with that.
Yeah, if I can.
No, I'd be comfortable with making it $100,000, but I think we have 3 projects that we know need to be funded in this next year's budget.
If I could just
there's
make
money left over, then anything between what's spent and $100,000 can be spent on the next traffic calming project.
What I was just going to suggest is clearly this is an issue the council has, considerable interest in. I also realize you're trying to weigh where the money comes from out of concern for the tax rate. I was just going to bring this up, and the council can certainly tell me it's a bad idea or you're not comfortable with it, but we did set aside $100,000 for undefined consulting services and planning. Obviously, that's just a ballpark number. Whether or not we use that $100,000 is kind of up in the air. I mean, I don't, it's the same type of expense in terms of it was envisioned to be sort of a one-time FY07 expense, just as some of these traffic calming or pedestrian safety measures. If the council is interested in finding additional funding for pedestrian safety related projects, that may be one source you want to consider in trying to keep the overall expenditures in the budget down. I certainly wouldn't suggest you take it too far down given some of the planning issues that we know may come up during the fiscal year, but it is a suggestion.
I was going to say, maybe there's a misunderstanding. And I am assuming that the council, did I understand that the council was agreeable to the issue on the police officer funding? Is that?
Mm-hmm. That's obviously another source as well. I'm just
but clarify, I may have missed it.
The proposal that Councilmember Elrich had put on the table was to make the assumption that given where we are in terms of the police department budget, that it was unlikely we were going to get up to 41 officers for all of fiscal 07. And that if you estimate, if you assume we do recruitment and if you assume we keep adding people, even so we are unlikely to be, at an average of 41 officers for the entire fiscal year, which is what the budget assumes. If you assume that we are at an average of, 38 officers for the fiscal year, that assumes that we're starting at 34 and we get up to, if we started at 34 and we got up to 41, even partway through the year, we would still be covered.
Didn't we agree to this like an hour and a half
Well,
ago?
that's what I'm trying to understand, because
So
if
is
I'm...
it 196?
No, it's
It's 130.
Thank
and
you.
so
That's all I wanted to
if we
know. I
have
understand
130,
this.
then I think that would cover this
It
particular
would.
fund.
I think
Okay.
Councilmember Elrich made a proposal.
I had
I
a
think we
great-
then
I-
moved off into specific items.
I thought we had said yes.
Let me reiterate what I thought I was balancing. I was taking the 130 plus the 6
You already
savings.
won, that's enough.
Yeah, I think people said yes to your proposal, unless I'm misunderstanding.
And the
So-
defibrillator and the
Yeah.
job readiness and the HDI issue.
That would cover these
And
expenses.
that balances 137 against 137.
Well, but I'm making a different proposal. Go ahead.
Did
I-
we say yes to the defibrillator? Is that what you're saying?
No, we haven't talked
Okay.
about that yet.
I think, we are going to be this year like we are in every year, certainly by halfway through the year, presented with money that we haven't spent. And it seems to me that that's a perfect opportunity then to revisit and gives people some time to think about planning projects for pedestrian safety or traffic calming, and then to reevaluate the budget halfway through the year and see what we haven't spent and see if there's time to move it over. I mean, the difference, Kathy, between your number and what I'm suggesting is if you take this 47 and add it to the 45, you're at 92. 100,000 only gets us another $8,000. So, I mean, she could get that just as easily by changing the carryover, right? And, carry over $8,000 or not carry over, spend $8,000 more of the reserve, and we could balance at 100. And I guess I'm agnostic in that regard, right? What I don't want to do is add anything in here that requires us to raise the rate. And unless everything we add is balanced by something we take out, we'd have to raise the rate or cut into our carryover.
I'm not proposing that we raise the rate. The reason I brought it up at this point is because I'm suggesting that the Elm-Lincoln traffic calming be subsumed into an overall item, which is a $100,000 for pedestrian safety. Now, there's 45 there now, and there's a call on 25 of that, at least in terms of what people expect. I'm suggesting that we put that into an overall line item, which would be $100,000, which would cover that if that's what people decide to do. I'm assuming that that would be the case, but I don't want to allocate it. I don't want to earmark all that money in that fund right now. So that's why I bring it up at that point. I'm suggesting that that's what we do instead of saying it's specifically for one intersection. That's why I bring it up at this point. And then my idea would be that then we go through the rest of the things. And by my calculations, I'm still below where we are. I'm still less money than where we are in the current budget. Go ahead.
I don't mind if we up the fund to $100,000, but given the, as Joy pointed out, the momentum of the project and the expectations that have been built by the people who live there based on all of the interaction thus far with the city and the fact that, by example, we're earmarking money for other projects that presumably have, people have met on and discussed and vetted, and then I want to see the money earmarked in the budget for this project. And I know that the people in Ward 2 want to see it, and I know that the people who experience 40 and 50 mile an hour traffic coming downhill in the wrong lane on the opposite side of the road around a corner past their families want to see it as well.
Terry.
Thank you, Mayor Porter. I would just say that I could support the additional funding strictly because of I'm familiar with the problem at this intersection, and I would do it just based on the public safety aspect of it. I would be reluctant to just put the money into a pot and at this point in time in increasing the pot, given our need to try to keep our budget numbers down. But based on the particular need at this particular intersection, I could support it.
Just a couple things to say, since I've been fairly silent tonight. I just want to say that I agree with some comments that Mark made earlier in terms of, I think a lot of the Ward 3 issues, particularly with streets and sidewalks, were taken care of in earlier years. So I feel like other places need to be taken care of, and I'm happy to support that as well. I had been heading into this hoping to come up with a tax reduction. The way things are going, I think that's looking less and less likely. At this point, I'm trying to find a way to just make additions and reductions just in terms of what we're looking at to be even or minus. I think we could get a sense from the city manager about the fund balance, what that number can take. But in order to get there, we need to know what that might take. And my proposal would be that the reductions are the 6 or 7, whatever it is, for the code enforcement officer, the $130,000 that Mark put forward for the police positions, and then for the additions, the Safe Tacoma, the round up to $100,000 that the mayor proposed, so that's a plus 55. And I think at this point we're fairly specific on what that's going to cover. It's going to cover Glenside and Wildwood. It's going to cover Boston, and it's going to cover Elm and Lincoln, and then the additional 5 for the HDI archives, and that's pretty much a wash. And that's where I would stop and then get guidance from the city manager on what we can do with the general fund balance.
Barb, could we cut the general fund balance 130 without causing you to
have a heart attack
or spin around in your chair too many times?
And we're talking about the
Diet
one.
Pepsi on the
I don't
dais.
have any more soda to toss.
Can I just clarify what we're talking about here on the handout, June 30th, 2007, we're talking about the 1.565 million?
Right, that's the number we're talking about. I want to make sure I understand the question specifically, because there's different proposals flying around. I apologize.
This is take 130 out and give a 1 cent tax reduction.
So the 1.565 becomes 1.435.
So you're talking about making the increase of expenditures over revenues higher, so you
Yes.
can add to the tax, so you can reduce the tax?
And I would also say that one assumption I'm making in that is that, given that we had the reassessments, which were limited by state law to 10%, and we saw that in terms of what the property tax revenues are going up in this budget, it's projected to be 9.9%. That's basically everybody's went up 10. Judging by what we know the assessments did, we're going to have that same increase next year. It's going to go up another 10.
Well, let me just say,
Is this a new reconciliation item?
yeah, the concern that I have about essentially not balancing the budget, but saying, well, we're going to cut into the reserves in order to provide a tax cut, is that a tax cut is something that you put in, it's more or less on a permanent basis. I mean, unless you plan to just say this is a one-year tax cut and we're going to change it next year. And unless you are planning to cut expenditures, you're putting it into a position where this is unsustainable. And I mean, to increase the gap so that your revenues exceed your expenditures exceed your revenues by an even larger number is a bad direction to be going in. It's a very bad direction.
My understanding, though, is we've already doing that with this budget, aren't we?
We just did 200 and some thousand worth getting to tonight.
Let's kind of, if I can back up, and I think the mayor put it quite well, but to kind of harken back to the discussion we had 2 weeks ago, and it is correct. I mean, we are drawing from the reserves for this budget, and that was something we talked about. That does not make me uncomfortable, because a lot of what we're doing, initially was to basically fund some one-time capital expenditures. It was things like the elevator cab or some of the items in the CIP that are not necessarily coming out of the equipment replacement reserve. For instance, there eventually have to be funded, but putting more money into like expanding the take-home car policy. That doesn't make me uncomfortable at all. Obviously, with the cars, one of the things we talked about was the need to be bumping up the ERR to account for that in future years. I think when you start getting into some ongoing expenses, as the mayor indicated, that's a little bit more problematic in my opinion, and certainly no one wants to sit in this chair and try to argue against cutting taxes. But truthfully, I think I would almost be more comfortable, I guess, if there were needs that the council feels you need to address, such as pedestrian safety, traffic calming, infrastructure improvements. That, in my mind, gives me a better comfort level in terms of pulling money from reserve than going in the route of cutting the tax rate. And one of the things I would just point out, and I'm not at all uncomfortable with Councilmember Elridge's proposal in terms of, reducing the police allocation for funding in light of the current vacancy rate. Obviously, everyone's hope a year from now is that we will be at a much higher staffing level. And if the $130,000 comes out, it's one thing if you decide to apply it to one-time capital projects. If you take a tax rate reduction and we are hopefully up to a higher staffing level, where is that money going to come from? Because that staffing is an ongoing expense. The Safe Tacoma initiative is obviously not, you don't start something like that as a pilot project. It's something that we intend to continue funding. And I think the council just needs to be cognizant of that.
So in essence, we will have to add a penny to the tax rate just to put the police money back in next year.
And what I asked for was the city manager's opinion on what that would do. I'm convinced by her argument.
And it's not just putting the police salaries back in, but I would mention Safe Tacoma. I mean, combined, and I'm not uncomfortable about that. And, it is a very tough market to recruit for police. So, the chances of our ever likely being at 41 authorized staff, 365 days in a year, is probably unlikely. I do acknowledge that. But, those two things combined, it's roughly $200,000 and some. That's more like a penny and a half on the tax rate. not 1 cent. I think, certainly as Councilmember Elridge or someone suggested is, particularly with some of these one-time capital projects, this council has had, I think, a very good practice of looking mid-year and seeing, what else there is to fund. And certainly I think that's a very good practice to continue.
I just want to say that we took all the other items one item at a time and started this conversation with not wanting to have it end up be horse trading, and it has become a conversation now about the tax rate and reducing taxes and changing funds around, and not a conversation about whether or not there's support for this item, and then following that, support for the Boston sidewalks as they flow in the order of the...
Right. I am happy to go back to where I thought we were, which was talking about the next item on the list, which was the Elm-Lincoln traffic calming, and I was proposing a fund for traffic calming, pedestrian safety, whatever you call it, of $100,000. And it seems like whatever people call it, whether you call it funding those 3 projects, whether you call it a fund for, it seems like that there is support for that, right?
Yes, there is.
There is support for putting aside $100,000, and whether we call it those particular projects, whether we call it we can.
I think we need to earmark the.
No, I don't want to revisit this later on with the discussion about whether or not we're going to do Elm Lincoln. I want to.
Right.
Okay. All right.
We're doing Elm and Lincoln.
If you want to then earmark it, it comes out to the same thing, I think, except I think I'm ending up with more money in that pot.
Yes, you are, and that's where we could have, what, 18,000 in savings?
So if you instead of funding it at $100,000,
so
you only...
42,000 for Elm Lincoln, 20,000 for Boston Avenue, and 25 for
And none of those
Leadside.
are going to come out exactly what they're estimated, so you're going to end up probably not being able to do some of them.
Yeah, I think basically, I'm not trying to get into the mill about whether you want to earmark or not, but if the council does want to go that route, obviously the Glenside, the Wildwood project, and Boston Avenue
are going to end
or
up
some
being
portion
more.
of Elm and Lincoln would essentially be covered by what's already in the budget. So
Okay, so that's zero impact.
It's a zero impact if the council wants to use the $45,000 in the CIP, and I'm just doing it, Councilmember Clay, for mathematical reasons, do those 2 projects. And really the addition is what the cost of Elm and Lincoln is. The other 2 could be accommodated, recognizing, of course, that pending perhaps some mid-year review, those pedestrian safety traffic calming funds would basically be dedicated or earmarked for the 3 specific projects being talked about, and other projects that may come up during the year would just have to be maybe perhaps discussed at mid-year, review.
So I guess again, I'm going to suggest the round number because I'm sure that those projects are going to come in more than we think. And, we can go ahead and earmark what's in the budget or what's the proposals now, and then say whatever 8,000 is left over, but that 8,000 is going to get eaten by cost increases. So that would be my suggestion. That takes care, if the council agrees to that, that takes care of the next 2 items. Is the council agreeable to that?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, all right.
Those who are awake.
And then I think the next item that hasn't been pulled off the list, I noticed that in the city manager's discussion of the C-Safe project, that there's actually some money for job readiness workshops in that. We just got awarded some money for job readiness workshops as part of the C-Safe project. Does that take care of your concerns?
No, that actually was grant money that was received for,
Right.
I believe, workshops for teens.
My understanding, obviously you had this item when I talked to Ms. Kendall yesterday, and Kramer, she can correct me if I'm wrong. My understanding is, I don't know that it's teens. Cindy, can you address the additional money that we received for the C-Safe program, specifically the portion that was for job skills training? Is that targeting youth or young adults, or do you have any information on that?
I'd say
Both
yes.
of those? Okay. That may not be as broad-based, Councilmember Siemens, as you intended.
Right, and really I was looking to address the need in the community for job skills training. The job readiness workshop is is a program that currently Community Ministries does in other portions of the county to provide evaluation of training needs and then providing training for getting ready to go to work, and also resume writing and job counseling, in addition to interviews, evaluation and counseling, and redirection to resources where individuals may have issues that challenge their ability to find work. And really, I was part of this is addressing the concept that we have members of the community who have needs that really do relate indirectly to public safety, and I feel it's a responsibility of this city government to address those needs. I know I looked at, there was some concern that local government shouldn't be doing social services. However, you know, when I'm looking at this and seeing that there are cutbacks in social services at the federal, state, and county levels, these are our neighbors. These are the people who live in our community. They're the ones who call up their council members with their problems. They're ones that, they're individuals that we should be reaching out to help. I look at the budgets for other municipalities. Rockville, I have a copy here if anyone wants to see it. Rockville budget includes almost $1 million of taxpayer money, not grant money, but taxpayer money. I think it's just over $900,000 for social programs for community assistance. And I think it's when we look at our view of Tacoma Park as being a progressive city, that it's certainly appropriate for us to put money into our public safety programs, such as the Safe Tacoma Initiative, but I think it's also important for us to address some of the social needs of the members of our community. And I felt that the job readiness workshop is something that we have heard from Ellen Robbins about the great need for our computers that we do provide, of individuals doing resume writing, but this goes to the next level, which is to actually provide some job counseling and some support for providing, for preparing those resumes and also preparing the individuals for work in the community and to help to move people towards self-sufficiency. Again, I reach out to our progressive ideals, and I have asked here for $7,000. The workshops are Community Ministries has said more recently than this that they would be able to provide workshops at a cost of $500 per workshop, and that they would be willing to do up to 10 workshops for $5,000, but base it on community need as people they advertise the availability of this program, and this there would be also some hidden costs, because I'm also suggesting that we provide the space in the community center for this community assistance.
Is this like a rec program, library, computer learning center?
I would think it would fall under. Yeah, I would think it would fall under the rec department, but I would certainly leave that to the city manager to make the decision.
And I think I was out getting a Diet Pepsi when you mentioned whether or not this is geared to adults or teenagers or everybody. This is an adult program?
It is an adult program, yes.
I actually, in looking over the list, I skipped over one. One of the things was gateway signage. If you'll indulge me, Terry, maybe we could skip back to that first, because I'd like to know how much money we're working with. There was a proposal, and I forget who made it, to eliminate the gateway signage item from the
Yes, I was actually the one that proposed that.
Okay.
And I felt it was important to keep the budget balanced, and so as I was putting forward a proposal, that was the area where I felt that we could save some money in the budget. It's a program that has not moved forward well. It's something that certainly can be a benefit to the city. However, when I contrast the value to the residents of gateway signage as contrasted with job readiness training and defibrillators for the community who use the city buildings and also for the employees of the city, I feel that we have it's one of the hard decisions that we have to make, and I think that the job readiness workshops and the defibrillators outweigh the value of the gateway signage.
And you had also said on the defibrillators you wanted 3 of them, not 1 of them. Is that right?
Yeah, certainly. I can't say that that defibrillators for the community center are important and then say that the recreation center on New Hampshire Avenue is unimportant. I think the residents who visit the city buildings certainly deserve the equal public safety. And so I was recommending that we include the defibrillators for both the Recreation Center on New Hampshire Avenue and the community center here. And then I certainly would not want to forget our dear employees at the Public Works facility. I believe we have just the 3 facilities, and so I was suggesting that in the interest of the safety of our residents and employees, that we provide automated defibrillators at all 3 locations. And I will also call to the council's attention that the state legislators and Governor Ehrlich have, on April 26th, signed a bill so that automated defibrillators will now be placed in all public schools in Maryland. Again, I think it emphasizes the recognition that these are both valuable life-saving devices and also safe and good devices for the community.
By my calculations, if the council goes with the reduction in the cost of the code enforcement officer and the 130 reduction in the vacant officer positions, we end up with a savings of about $136,000. The things that we have basically said okay to on the plus side include the Safe Tacoma, which is 75, and then, if I'm understanding the council correctly, an additional 55, taking from 45 to 100, the Pedestrian Safety Initiative, which is comes to a total of it's too late for me to do it in my head.
130.
130. And so that leaves us with about 7,000 left. So I think if the council wishes to spend more than 7,000, we are in fact going to have to figure out a way to get more of a reduction.
Okay, can you go through those numbers one more time?
Yeah, we need to highlight these things down the list.
Okay. The reductions that have been agreed to so far by the council is it's not reducing the police officer positions, it's making the assumption that we won't fund all the police officer positions for the entire fiscal year. It's making that assumption. And what goes with it, in my view at least, is a commitment that if by some miracle we get up to 41 by July 1st, that we go ahead and fund them out of unappropriated reserve. But if we assume that we're not going to get up to 41 on average for the full year, and the assumption that Mark made in his calculation was that the average would be no greater than 38 over the entire fiscal year, that frees up, and then you net out of that the overtime that would be required if we don't get up to 41 positions over the course of the fiscal year. You end up with a net of about 130 savings.
Right.
Okay, and then if you make the change that the council agreed to in the code enforcement position, you save about, according to the calculations, $6,873. That gives you $136,873 savings that the council has agreed to.
So
Okay.
I guess that's where I'm seeing.
You're not seeing 136,000? 130,000 plus 6. 6 plus 6, 873. Yeah, the 58.
So I got the one.
Yeah, so 136, 873. That's, of the things the council's agreed to, how much of a reduction that gets to. Okay, now on the spending side, the council's agreed to spend 75,000 of that on the Safe Tacoma initiative. I thought I heard an agreement to go to 100,000 on the pedestrian safety, which is an increase of 55,000 over the 45 that's currently in the budget. You add those two things together and you get 130.
What about the 5,000 for HDI?
Well, we haven't gotten there yet. So I'm saying, the point that I'm making is that well, let me just say, where we are right now is that if we just draw the line at the bottom of the Boston Avenue sidewalk installation item, to that point, we have $6,873 left to spend unless we want to propose additional reductions. That is my understanding of where we are. Now, what Terry has just put on the table is, it sounds to me like he's saying he wants to go beyond that, and he wants to pay for it by reducing $20,000 out of gateway signage. So that, am I understanding you correctly, Terry?
That's correct. And I was cutting back my request for the job readiness workshops to $5,000 and increasing the defibrillators to $9,000 to provide defibrillators for all three city buildings. And so that's $16,000. I was suggesting that we cut out the gateway signage funding and have a net realization of an additional $4,000.
Okay, so you're putting that together as a package. What is the council's thought about that? Yes.
The gateway signage is part of the New Hampshire Avenue package. I'm not calculating because I'm sometimes numerically challenged, so I've been looking over the city manager's shoulder because I know she's very adept with these things. And it shows that we are only $15,000 away from getting to our numbers. And I would like to suggest, if it's okay with the city manager, that we pull the rest of the money out of the reserves. Would you have an objection to that small amount?
So what's I'm sorry, I was being asked a question. What was your proposal, Colleen?
I can just recap. I think the numbers the mayor laid out in terms of the reductions, the 136,873, I think we've been through. What I'm kind of hearing, or maybe I'm jumping ahead from prior conversations, is we had the Safe Tacoma initiative for $75,000, an additional $55,000 for pedestrian safety initiatives. There seemed to be support both this evening and before of the archive funding of $5,000. Councilmember Siemens amended, I guess, Terry, if I understood you correctly, the job training thing for $5,000. I'm just making an assumption right now for argument's sake, and the defibrillators for $9,000.
Right.
If I did my math right, that's $149,000. The only item that has a specific cost associated with it that is left is the pathway lighting in Ward 2. I can't speak for Councilmember Clay, as far as her feelings on that, but basically the difference, without dealing with the lighting, is $12,127. There's two options for that I would be entirely comfortable with. It is, when you look in the grand scheme of the city's budget, most of these items are one-time things. I would not be uncomfortable at all if you want to take it from reserves. The other option, as I mentioned a while ago, is we had the one-time money for consulting services, which are just sort of a plug number, if you will. It could equally come from that allocation, because that's not a significant reduction. It would still leave, $88,000 for any kind of consulting services. So I think there's two very appropriate funding sources, as far as where you are right now, if my understanding of where the council's at is correct.
Okay, I think that the council's made a decision in terms of some of the individual things. I would agree with you, and perhaps I should have said that I did hear a support for the Historic Tacoma Archives request. If you add that to where we are, that takes you to 135.
My assumption would be, perhaps since there's so few items left, that the council may just want to go ahead and render your decision and see how far out you are, because I have a feeling that we're not really that far apart, and I think you could probably wrap this up fairly expeditiously.
Could we just vote on that proposal?
Okay.
Before we do,
But
when I read through the information on the defibrillators, I wasn't sure that we were going to be in a ready position to deal with that. Wayne, do you have any
It's gonna
thoughts on that?
take considerable staff time.
Yeah, we need an agenda.
We have to train a whole lot of staff.
Because they have to check them every day.
They have to be inspected every day. It's a lot of record keeping, a lot of training, and it's recurring training. You have to be recertified on a continuing basis, I would imagine yearly or maybe 2 years. We have to locate a doctor to oversee the program. If we do it, I'd recommend we do it on a pilot basis of one, and we put it in New Hampshire Avenue Gym, where you're most likely to have a heart attack. It's someplace where there's a lot of physical exertion.
Here's another suggestion.
If we do that, though, I would like to go ahead and budget for the three. I'm concerned that we don't know specifically at this point, after so long of talking about these, we don't have a complete briefing on it.
Let me make a suggestion at this point. I think Wayne brings up a good point. It's the defibrillators, I agree, are important things. I was concerned, and I think Bruce makes an excellent point, that the training requirements associated with the defibrillators, we don't really know what that would entail in terms of what we might have to expend. We also know that we have an unappropriated reserve. And what we have done in past years is we have said there are some items that we think might be good things to do. Either they aren't a high priority, or in this case, we don't really know exactly what they would entail. And so we put them on a list, and we say we will look at these sort of first for expenditures from the unappropriated reserve, and that would give us some time to look at the training and staffing implications of doing this.
We need a date certain to make that decision, though, because this has been on the table for well over a year that we've been talking about defibrillators, and we keep saying that we need to learn what we need to do. Why haven't we learned it yet? What does this council have to do to actually get the information we need so we can make the decision? I think we should budget for it and move forward with it.
If we took the items that are left, including the $9,000 for the defibrillators, the $5,000 for the historic Tacoma, $10,000 for the path lights, and we were then to take $25,000 of the development fund money, we would come out $3,000 ahead, and we wouldn't have to take any reserves.
Fine.
Second. Third.
So that's reducing the council's priority of doing development in order to make a bunch of things that we haven't looked at yet happen.
We've got this reserve. It makes no difference to us whether we take it out of the reserve or whether we take it out of this item, because if we run into enough projects where we're going to spend it on economic development, we can go to the reserve and get it, and we're going to have unspent money. We know we're going to have unspent this money this year. The reason I don't ever feel bad about going into reserves in the first place is it's money we tax people for in a year before or 2 years before, and we didn't spend and accumulate. So when I first came on the council, we had this enormous reserve of other people's money that we had never spent but we had taxed for. So it doesn't bother me to balance a budget using money that we had taxed people and they expected us to spend. I don't care whether you take it out of the reserve or you knock this item down $12,000. That's fine with me, and I think the defibrillators are a good idea. We need to figure out how to get them in place so we can use them.
Well,
and they're a one-time expense.
Well, no, they're not. It sounds like they're ongoing staff training.
Well, there's staff.
Well, we need a presentation then to this council, and I think we need to budget for it, and this council can decide not to do it later, but I think we need it in the budget so that when we get the presentation, we need to schedule that so we have it. We need the information so we can provide the direction to do it.
Can I offer a friendly amendment to Councilmember Clay's proposal? If we leave the $100,000 intact for the development issues and do what the city manager proposed of taking the difference out of the fund balance, do people support that?
Makes no difference.
Sure,
yes.
Makes no difference to me.
4.
Okay.
So you're just talking about funding everything else on the list?
Yes.
Yes.
Well, I think that things that haven't been decided by the council should be decided by the council. If the defibrillator, in the council's view, is one of those things, then it should be an agenda item before the money is expended.
What about the other items on the list? We've talked about the Historic Tacoma Archives. How about the other items on the list? How about the job readiness workshops?
Yeah, they haven't been discussed by the council as an agenda item.
Right, oh, I see.
They have to be discussed as an agenda item. What does the council decide? If we set aside the money for it and then the council decides not to use it, then nothing comes out of our fund balance.
I would support that.
Okay, but you want a budget for those individual items.
Right.
What does the council want to do? Is that what people want to do?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, all right, we will do that then. Is the staff clear on where we are? Okay, all right, good.
I believe so.
All right, well, we got through it, and we are not coming back on Tuesday, so you guys have Tuesday evening off.
Well, thank you.